What if history wasn't written in monuments, but in moments so absurd they almost feel made up? A president who gave press conferences from an electric horse. Another who bowled alone to stay sane. And yes, someone actually got married in the White House after raising the bride like a daughter. This isn't the history you learned in school. This is the raw, ridiculous, and relentlessly real story of American power, told one bizarre fact at a time. Buckle up. Because once you hear fact hash 1, you're not stopping until hash 111 slaps you in the face. Dwight D. Eisenhower designed the Masters Golf Course. Picture this. Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, the man who orchestrated the largest amphibious invasion in human history, now squinting at a sand trap, muttering about dog legs and green speeds. Dwight D. Eisenhower, in between liberating Europe and becoming the 34th President of the United States, also took time to leave his mark on Augusta National Golf Club. It's not that he actually drafted the blueprints. That job went to architect Alistair McKenzie and co-founder Bobby Jones. But Eisenhower, who played over 800 rounds at Augusta during his presidency, influenced the course so profoundly that it's hard to tell where his presidency ended and his putter began. He lobbied to remove a pesky tree on the 17th hole that routinely ruined his drives. Augusta didn't budge. Instead, they named it the Eisenhower tree. Then, in a perfect moment of poetic irony, the tree outlasted him, until a storm took it down in 2014. Ike might have called that divine intervention, or karma in cleats. This was the same man who warned America of the military-industrial complex and signed the Civil Rights Act of 1957. Yet his true White House war was waged on Bermuda grass. Eisenhower had a putting green installed outside the Oval Office and appointed a personal golf pro to his detail. His press briefings often held at the 9th hole. The contradiction is delicious. A war-hardened general seeking peace in bunkers and birdies. But maybe that's not so ridiculous. Maybe war heroes deserve whimsical escapes. Or maybe the absurdity is the escape itself. Eisenhower's love for golf wasn't just a hobby. It was a political strategy. On the green, he was calm, photogenic, and above all, human. Speaking of strangely human moments, let's now meet another commander-in-chief who found himself in a far less graceful battle, with a snack. George W. Bush once choked on a pretzel while watching a football game. There are moments when history doesn't hinge on treaties, wars, or ideological battles. Sometimes it hinges on a salted carbohydrate. In January 2002, President George W. Bush, leader of the free world, commander of nuclear codes, nearly met his end not on foreign soil, but in his own living room during a solitary snack break. A pretzel lodged in his throat, causing him to faint, fall off the couch, and wake up with a bruised cheek and a split lip. What's truly absurd isn't the snack-related peril, it's the setting. There's a surreal cinematic quality to imagining the president sprawled on the floor mid-Sunday football, betrayed by a piece of processed wheat. A man who once stood on the rubble of Ground Zero with a bullhorn was months later KO'd by a pretzel. The contradiction is so thick you could dip it in mustard. Of course, the press went wild. Cartoonists had a field day. Late-night hosts ran with it for weeks. Bush, to his credit, leaned into the mockery. He joked about being tough on terrorism, but vulnerable to crunchy snacks. Somewhere in all this, the absurdity morphed into something oddly humanizing. The guy who mispronounced nuclear and declared mission accomplished too soon was, it turned out, as mortal as anyone else, with snack-based vulnerabilities to prove it. And while the public chuckled, the Secret Service probably added choking hazard prevention to their crisis protocols. One wonders how close the 25th Amendment came to being triggered by a rogue piece of snack food. We'll never know. And speaking of secrets and things quietly falling apart, let's now turn to a 19th century president whose health crisis was a mystery even to his closest allies. His name? Chester A. Arthur. His secret? A kidney quietly plotting his demise. Chester A. Arthur secretly suffered from Bright's disease, a kidney ailment during his presidency. Some men lead with charisma, others with scandal. Chester A. Arthur led with mutton chops and a terminal illness no one was supposed to know about. Sworn into office after the assassination of President James Garfield, Arthur ascended the presidency under a cloud of skepticism and quietly carried a darker cloud in his own bloodstream. Bright's disease, a catch-all term for kidney disorders in the 19th century, was slow, cruel, and at the time, incurable. Arthur was diagnosed not long after taking office. He told almost no one. Instead, he wore tailored suits, redecorated the White House, and entertained dignitaries with stoic formality while slowly disintegrating inside. The press noted his fatigue. He claimed it was stress. In reality, his body was shutting down, one glomerulus at a time. He tried to live like a man who had time. He didn't. He vacationed, traveled to Yellowstone, and soaked in mineral springs like they might reverse the inevitable. They didn't. But perhaps the most baffling part was his silence. He kept the diagnosis hidden, fearing public panic or political weakness. His cabinet was largely in the dark. His legacy, quieter still. It's one of those eerie ironies, how a president known for doing relatively little during his term was in fact waging a private war every day against an invisible enemy. And maybe that's the story. Not what he accomplished, but what he endured, silently. Now imagine sitting through meetings, signing legislation, hosting foreign envoys, all while your kidneys fail. That's the real executive endurance test. Speaking of enduring pain with poise, let's pivot to another American leader who turned a lifelong ailment into a fixture of his public persona. This next man met his chronic agony with something soft and strangely iconic: a rocking chair. Enter John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy owned a rocking chair to help alleviate his chronic back pain. John F. Kennedy's presidency is often remembered in black and white glamour. Camelot, crisp suits, the soaring cadence of a new generation rising. But beneath the sheen of youth and eloquence was a man trapped in a body that betrayed him daily. Kennedy's back was a battlefield, a site of near-constant pain born from a lifetime of ailments, war injuries, and failed surgeries. The suave, sun-kissed president needed something to dull the pain, and he found it in the lulling rhythm of a rocking chair. This wasn't a decorative choice. It was medical necessity wrapped in old-world Americana, crafted by a Virginia furniture maker and recommended by his doctor. The chair became Kennedy's quiet salvation. He kept one in the Oval Office, one on Air Force One, multiple at his homes. Reporters joked he couldn't go anywhere without one. They weren't wrong. And so, this beacon of modern energy, the youngest elected president in U.S. history, rocked like a weary grandfather behind closed doors. The chair offered relief, but also a paradox. The image of youthful vigor supported by a device of age and infirmity. No one saw it coming, and that was the point. Kennedy, ever the master of image, masked fragility beneath tailored charisma. Which brings us to another man from Hollywood who knew how to play a part. Except his stage wasn't the White House alone. He came from lights, cameras, and residuals. A union man, oddly enough. Let's now talk about the only U.S. president to ever head a labor union. And no, it wasn't Bernie Sanders in disguise. It was Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was the only president to head a union, the Screen Actors Guild. Before he became the patron saint of small government and trickle-down economics, Ronald Reagan was something else entirely. A union boss. As president of the Screen Actors Guild in the 1940s and 50s, Reagan wasn't battling communism abroad. He was wrangling actors and negotiating contracts with studio heads. Imagine the Gipper, not in the Oval Office, but in a smoke-filled meeting room trying to explain residual rights to B-list character actors. It's less Mr. President and more Mr. DeMille. This was Reagan before the cowboy hat stuck, before the jelly beans, before he weaponized charms into national policy. As SAG president, he dealt with real labor issues, pay disputes, blacklisting, the Red Scare. He testified before Congress. He debated morality clauses. He shook hands with men who later tried to have him blacklisted, before he changed his mind and tried to blacklist them back. It's bizarre, really. Reagan, the anti-union icon, once the very definition of organized labor leadership. But like many of the contradictions that came to define him, it simply slipped under the radar. Union leader turned union breaker. Blue-collar spokesman turned trickle-down salesman. Hollywood liberal turned conservative messiah. But don't worry, he didn't drop the showbiz charm. Reagan's presidency was one long production. Tight scripting, emotional arcs, camera-friendly pauses. You could argue he never stopped acting, just changed studios. And if you look closely, the entire Reagan era plays like a sequel to his earlier work. This time, the role of a lifetime, President of the United States. Now let's move from the man who led the Screen Actors Guild to the man who led a nation while owning people. Because not all American contradictions are cinematic. Some are chilling. Say hello to Zachary Taylor, a Northern general with Southern chains. Zachary Taylor owned slaves, despite being from the North. Zachary Taylor is one of those historical anomalies that make American history feel like an elaborate cosmic dare. Born in Virginia, raised in Kentucky, and affiliated more with the North than the Deep South, Taylor somehow still managed to be a slave owner. A fact that makes any geographical or moral assumptions you might hold snap like a dry twig. A career military man, Taylor wasn't exactly a policy wonk. He was a soldier first, politician never. His presidency was thrust upon him like an ill-fitting uniform, and he wore it with the discomfort of someone who knew full well that he wasn't meant to sit behind a desk with diplomatic stationery. Still, he brought his slaves with him to Washington. A bizarre but fitting detail in a country that, at the time, managed to wrap moral compromise in the language of freedom. It wasn't just personal hypocrisy, it was national. Here was a man from a so-called free state, entrusted with uniting a country splintering over slavery, while privately maintaining the very institution tearing it apart. Taylor opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories, yet refused to free his own slaves. It's not irony, it's America. His death came suddenly, after only 16 months in office. Some say it was bad cherries and milk. Others whispered darker theories. Either way, the nation buried another contradiction in a military uniform. A Northerner with Southern chains. A president who fought for unity while profiting from bondage. Speaking of complex legacies, let's pivot to a man whose name barely registers today, but whose impact on public knowledge and civic literacy quietly shaped a city and a library. His name? Millard Fillmore. His weapon of choice? Books. Millard Fillmore had a large personal library and was instrumental in establishing the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. Millard Fillmore, the kind of name that sounds like a punchline even before the setup, is often dismissed as one of the forgettable presidents, a compromise candidate, a transitional figure, a dusty footnote. But behind the blandness lies a quieter form of rebellion, literacy. Fillmore was obsessed with books, not as political props, not as decorative objects, but as lifelines. Born into poverty, Fillmore taught himself to read and write. He scavenged for books. He memorized passages. He absorbed them like a starving man with a menu. Eventually, he built a personal library large enough to rival the collections of men twice his stature. And more importantly, he shared it. Fillmore didn't just collect books. He distributed knowledge. He helped found the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library, turning personal enlightenment into public good. There's something strangely noble about a man so uninspiring, on the national stage becoming a quiet hero of civic infrastructure. While other presidents waged wars or signed sweeping legislation, Fillmore pushed literacy. He wanted average citizens to have access to the same information that had saved him from obscurity. It wasn't sexy. It wasn't headline-making. But it was radical in its own way. So yes, he also signed the Fugitive Slave Act. Yes, he paved the road to national disaster. But in between the moral failures, he gave Buffalo a brain. History, ever the cruel narrator, tends to remember the worst and forget the rest. But sometimes the rest is worth remembering. Next up, we enter the blood-soaked pages of a lesser-known general-turned-president, Franklin Pierce, a man whose battlefield valor couldn't save him from the battlefield of his own mind. Franklin Pierce was a brigadier general in the Mexican-American War. Franklin Pierce had something to prove. Born into modest privilege and forever haunted by obscurity, he grabbed at the Mexican-American War like it was his ticket to matter. And for a brief moment, drenched in dust and drenched in sweat, it worked. He earned the rank of brigadier general, a title that looked excellent on a resume and even better in a campaign speech. Never mind the details, the uniform fit. But his military service was less glory under fire and more tragic comedy of errors. He was injured before even seeing combat, thrown from his horse, leg mangled, pride bruised. Still, he insisted on leading his men. He limped, he wobbled, he commanded. Some called it brave, others called it reckless. Most just called it awkward. His soldiers weren't impressed. Rumors swirled that he fainted during battle. Pierce insisted it was a knee injury. Either way, his battlefield career became a footnote wrapped in gauze. Yet somehow this limping general rode that reputation straight into the White House. It was the 19th century after all. You didn't need to win a war, just survive one with enough flair. Pierce capitalized on his war record the way some men capitalize on a good mustache, distract from everything else. But once in office, his administration was more wounded than his leg. The country spiraled further toward civil war. His personal life collapsed under the weight of tragedy, valor on paper, chaos in reality. And on that note, what happens when valor becomes a liability? When healing the wounds of war is seen as weakness? Let's talk about Andrew Johnson, a man whose presidential legacy is defined by survival, impeachment, and a bitter refusal to bend. Andrew Johnson was impeached largely due to his lenient policies towards the South after the Civil War. There are many ways to become historically infamous. Andrew Johnson, for reasons both spectacularly avoidable and deeply personal, managed one of the more dramatic routes: impeachment. He didn't steal. He didn't commit treason. He didn't even choke on a pretzel. No, Johnson got impeached for being too forgiving. After the Civil War, the country stood like a half-collapsed building, bloody, resentful, unfinished. And Johnson, a Southern Democrat put on the ticket solely to balance Lincoln's moral gravity, was suddenly in charge of the Reconstruction project. He approached it with the tact of a man trying to patch drywall with wet paper. His policies were shockingly lenient toward the defeated Confederacy. He pardoned Southern elites. He vetoed civil rights protections. He basically gave the South a legislative welcome-back hug. Congress, controlled by radical Republicans who wanted accountability and reform, was not amused. Tensions escalated until Johnson violated the Tenure of Office Act by firing Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. It was a political trap, and he walked straight into it. Impeachment followed. The trial, dramatic and performative, ended in his acquittal by a single vote. He survived, but just barely. His presidency never recovered, and his legacy soured like milk in the southern sun. It's a strange irony. The man who remained loyal to the Union during secession was later condemned for trying too hard to restore it. And for all his defiance, all his thunderous vetoes, Johnson left office a pariah, muttering grievances and clinging to lost causes. But if Johnson governed with a wounded ego, his successor brought something different to the table: charisma, chaos, and a voice that sounded like gravel being poured over velvet. Let's turn the page to Ulysses S. Grant, a man who couldn't sing to save his life. Ulysses S. Grant had a terrible singing voice, according to his wife. Ulysses S. Grant could command armies, end civil wars, and drink bourbon with the steely calm of a seasoned poker player. But sing? That, according to his wife Julia, was a battlefield best left alone. He had no ear for music, she allegedly said, which is a polite way of admitting that whenever Grant opened his mouth to sing, even the wallpaper winced. The image is delicious. A stoic war hero, feared by Confederates and revered by Unionists, reduced to domestic comedy by the tragedy of his vocal cords. One can imagine Julia gently redirecting him away from lullabies and toward anything else: cigar lighting, memoir writing, horseback riding, anything that didn't involve auditory offense. And yet there's something fitting about Grant being bad at something so human and joyous. He was never a glad-hander or a speechmaker. He preferred silence, precision, the brutal simplicity of military command. His presidency, while plagued by scandal and poor judgment in appointments, was oddly devoid of personal vanity. He didn't care for appearances. He barely tolerated small talk. And clearly he didn't let vocal ineptitude stop him from trying. Which raises a question. What do we forgive in our leaders? We tolerated Grant's corruption-prone cabinet. We tolerated his drinking. But we draw the line at his attempt to carry a tune. Still, his tone deafness is oddly endearing. It makes him feel real. A flawed genius humming off-key while the nation tried to hum in unison. History often forgets the sound of a person. It remembers the echo. Next up, we dive into another echo from the battlefield. This time, not just one scar, but 5. And the man who carried them wasn't just a war hero. He was also a future president, Rutherford B Hayes. Rutherford B Hayes served in the Civil War and was wounded 5 times. If endurance had a mascot, it might just be Rutherford B Hayes. Not exactly a household name, sure. But before he ever tiptoed through the thicket of contested elections and backroom deals, he marched through actual battlefields, shedding blood like it was part of his resume. 5 times. That's how many times he was wounded during the Civil War. That's not bad luck. That's a lifestyle. Hayes didn't just serve. He volunteered. He wasn't drafted or dragged. He chose to go, despite having a comfortable life, a young family, and a legal career humming along just fine. And when he got there, he didn't hide in the back. He led from the front, sword drawn, body exposed, like a man auditioning for martyrdom. His wounds were not symbolic. One bullet fractured his arm so severely that amputation was on the table. Another injury laid him out for weeks, but Hayes kept returning to the front lines, stitched up and strapped in, because some part of him must have believed that was the only place worth being. It's easy to gloss over Civil War valor with sepia-toned reverence, but think about it. 5 wounds. That's 5 moments where the universe flipped a coin and Hayes lived. That's 5 reminders that the country's future might just be built on the stubborn resilience of men who refused to stay down. So when the time came for politics, Hayes brought more than policy positions. He brought scars. And whether you view his presidency as healing or hollow, you can't deny he earned his seat the hard way. And speaking of men who once taught others before leading them, let's now turn to James A. Garfield, a professor of Latin and Greek who was unexpectedly fluent in the brutal language of politics. James A. Garfield was a college professor of Latin and Greek before entering politics. James A. Garfield was the kind of man who could diagram a sentence in Greek while lecturing in Latin and still be charismatic enough to get elected. Before politics, before the White House, before the tragedy that made him a cautionary tale of presidential security, Garfield was a classicist, a man who taught dead languages with the passion of someone trying to resurrect them. He didn't just dabble, he mastered. At the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute, now Hiram College, Garfield taught multiple subjects, including math and ancient languages, often jumping between lectures like a human syllabus. Students were drawn to him not because he was easy, he wasn't, but because he made knowledge feel like a calling. He had a way of making Greek verbs sound like military strategy and Latin phrases feel like moral imperatives. That intellectual rigor didn't disappear when he entered Congress. He brought it with him, wielding logic like a blade, dissecting arguments, and leaving ideological opponents slack-jawed in committee meetings. He could write with elegance, speak with precision, and argue with devastating calm. He was, in short, a scholar accidentally placed in a bar fight. But academia is not politics, and virtue is not invincibility. Garfield would learn that the hard way. His mind might have been sharpened on Aristotle, but the bullets that found him in a train station came from a man who didn't care about conjugations. Still, the vision remains: a professor president. A man who could have spent his life cloistered in libraries, but chose the battlefield of American governance instead. And now, speaking of strange surgeries and secrets, we move on to a president who decided the best place for an emergency operation was a yacht. Let's talk about Grover Cleveland and the appendectomy he didn't want you to know about. Grover Cleveland performed his own appendectomy aboard a yacht to keep it secret from the public. Grover Cleveland, large in frame and famously quiet in demeanor, once made a decision so astonishingly covert and bizarre that it feels like it belongs in a medical thriller. In the summer of 1893, with the country spiraling into a financial panic, Cleveland noticed a lesion on the roof of his mouth, later diagnosed as a cancerous tumor. His solution? Secret surgery. On a yacht. While floating down the East River, Cleveland feared that public knowledge of his illness would destabilize markets already teetering on collapse. His answer wasn't transparency or rest. It was to disappear aboard a friend's yacht, sedate himself with ether, and have a team of trusted doctors remove not just the tumor, but part of his upper jaw. The operation took place in the vessel's salon, converted into a makeshift operating theater. No press, no leaks, just gauze, scalpels, and presidential denial. The surgery was successful, the prosthetic jaw fitted, and Cleveland returned to public life within weeks, offering vague explanations for his temporary disappearance. The public never suspected. Not until years later did the story surface, confirmed by surviving doctors and medical records. By then, it was too late to be scandalous. It was just history. The absurdity here isn't just the stealth or the setting. It's the sheer theatricality of the deception. Imagine modern presidents trying to hide major surgery by hopping on a yacht and ghosting the country. It would be on TikTok within minutes. Cleveland's medical gamble paid off and the markets remained calm. But he set a strange precedent, that a president's body could be treated like a national secret. And now we move from closed-mouth surgeries to open doors, specifically the first automatic ones in the White House, courtesy of a man with a flair for tech, Benjamin Harrison. Benjamin Harrison installed button-operated automatic doors at the White House. If there's one thing history doesn't prepare you for, it's the delight of discovering that a Gilded Age president was basically an early adopter of smart home technology. Benjamin Harrison, the 23rd President of the United States, didn't just serve a quiet, buttoned-up term. He brought literal buttons into the White House, as in push-button-operated electric doors, installed, operational. In the 1890s, you can practically hear the steampunk gears whirring. The doors, connecting rooms in the presidential residence, opened with a button push. No need for staff to haul the heavy panels open. A marvel of convenience. And ironically, a source of mild paranoia. Because while Harrison introduced electricity into the White House, he and his wife were reportedly terrified of it. Legend has it they were so unsettled by the new electric light switches that they avoided touching them, opting to leave the job to White House staff. The man who ushered in electric automation wouldn't flip his own lights. And that's the beauty of the contradiction. A president who embraced innovation but hesitated at its fingertips. A man who wanted progress but feared the spark. Harrison was a technophile in theory, a traditionalist in practice, America incarnate. Of course, his presidency wasn't just about gadgets. He faced tariffs, voting rights issues, and a bitter re-election battle. But it's the image of the button-door president that lingers. Part magician, part Luddite, living in a house where walls moved with a whisper, and no one dared turn on the lamps. Which brings us to another first, this time on 4 wheels. Let's talk about the president who took the wheel, not for business, not for ceremony, but for the simple joy of cruising, William McKinley. William McKinley was the first president to ride in an automobile for leisure, not official business. There are presidential firsts that shape nations, And then there are the ones that involve sitting back in a motorized contraption, tipping your hat to the crowd, and letting the future hum beneath your feet. William McKinley's contribution to history's long list of firsts wasn't legislative or rhetorical. It was vehicular. He became the first sitting president to take a joyride in an automobile. No parade, no photo op, no agenda. Just McKinley, a car, and the simple thrill of movement. At the time, the automobile wasn't yet a status symbol. It was a curiosity, loud, unreliable, prone to breakdowns and existential dread. It was the kind of machine that made horses nervous and senators suspicious. But McKinley, ever the curious conservative, climbed aboard anyway. Perhaps he understood what many didn't, that progress often arrives not with fanfare, but with noise, oil stains, and a whiff of danger. The image of McKinley, top hat, waistcoat, hands possibly gripping a door for dear life, as the gasoline-powered machine jolted through dusty streets, is oddly poetic. A president at the dawn of the 20th century, letting go of reins and embracing combustion. Of course, McKinley's presidency would end in tragedy, but in that moment, riding shotgun with the future, he looked like a man coasting toward modernity. And speaking of rides with questionable safety precautions, let's now turn to a president who brought a boxing ring into the White House, and not for decoration. His fists were as political as his policies. Enter Theodore Roosevelt, hunter, soldier, writer, an occasional sparring partner. Theodore Roosevelt was an avid boxing enthusiast and once fought a professional boxer in the White House. Theodore Roosevelt didn't just talk tough. He had the bruises to prove it. Among his many eccentric hobbies, collecting animals, writing thousands of letters, redefining masculinity, boxing stands out as his most literal approach to problem solving. Long before MMA was a pay-per-view spectacle, Roosevelt was lacing up gloves and inviting professional boxers to spar with him in the East Room of the White House. That's not a metaphor. The man actually arranged full-contact bouts under the presidential roof. And these weren't polite exhibitions. Roosevelt didn't pull punches, and neither did his opponents. One match left him partially blind in one eye, an injury he kept secret for years because, of course, telling the American public that you were half-blinded by your own boxing habit might have undermined the whole man of action brand. But for Roosevelt, pain was never the enemy. Weakness was. He cultivated his toughness like a performance art, a form of governance through machismo. His presidency wasn't just about trust-busting or building battleships. It was about embodying vitality, making politics physical. He once said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." He just didn't mention that sometimes the stick had gloves. This was a man who viewed life as a campaign of personal conquest. If his enemies weren't political, he'd invent physical ones. And the White House, instead of softening him, became his personal dojo. Now, if Roosevelt fought the weight of the world with his fists, his successor took a more horizontal approach. Let's move from the boxing ring to the bedroom, or more specifically, the snoring that could rattle the rafters. Meet William Howard Taft, a man whose real opponent was his own breathing. William Howard Taft suffered from sleep apnea. William Howard Taft, the president most remembered for getting stuck in a bathtub, had problems that extended far beyond bathroom logistics. Behind his massive frame and meticulously curled mustache was a man constantly at war with his own body. Chief among the enemies? Sleep apnea, a disorder that caused his breathing to repeatedly stop during sleep, jerking him awake and preventing anything close to restful slumber. The image is almost tragicomic. The heaviest president in U.S. history, struggling not just to fit into his office chairs, but into a peaceful night's rest. It wasn't just about snoring. It was the kind of disorder that left him exhausted during the day, nodding off in meetings, struggling to stay alert. Imagine a cabinet briefing interrupted by thunderous nasal eruptions, followed by a groggy Taft blinking into consciousness as if surfacing from a trench. But like most things about Taft, this detail was softened by humor and buried under bureaucracy. The man who preferred the legal bench to the bully pulpit found little comfort in the pressures of presidential life. He reportedly hated the job, and the job didn't seem to like him back. His health declined. His sleep got worse. His presidency plodded along in a haze of fatigue, and yet he endured until he got what he really wanted, a seat on the Supreme Court. There, in the more structured, less chaotic world of legal reasoning, perhaps he finally found the peace that eluded him in restless, breathless nights. And speaking of final resting places, let's turn now to a president who left his mark not in the hills of Virginia or the graveyards of Illinois, but in the very capital he once ruled. Meet Woodrow Wilson, the only president buried in Washington, D.C. Woodrow Wilson was the only president buried in Washington, D.C. For a man obsessed with legacies, Woodrow Wilson made one final, strangely poetic decision: to be buried not in his home state of Virginia, nor alongside the pantheon of presidential giants, but in the city that nearly broke him. Washington, D.C. His body rests in the National Cathedral, a towering Gothic sprawl of stone and shadow, right in the nation's symbolic nerve center. It's fitting, in a twisted sort of way. Wilson's presidency was a study in moral ambition and catastrophic fallout. He gave us the Federal Reserve, the income tax, and the dream of a League of Nations. He also resegregated federal offices and suffered a devastating stroke that left his wife quietly running the country in his place. For a man who tried to remake the world, his final resting place sits not in grandeur, but in uneasy proximity to power. A reminder that ambition without self-awareness becomes mausoleum marble. Visitors don't flock to Wilson's tomb the way they do to Lincoln's or JFK's. There are no eternal flames, no towering obelisks, just cold stone and quiet contradictions. He is, quite literally, the ghost in the nation's capital. And speaking of phantoms hiding in plain sight, let's pivot from buried presidents to buried secrets. Wilson's personal failures were hidden behind lofty speeches. Our next man had no such illusions. He didn't hide his flaws, he just buried them under charm and women. Lots of women. Enter Warren G. Harding, president, philanderer, and one-man scandal machine. Warren G. Harding had a number of extramarital affairs during his presidency, which later became public. Warren G. Harding was the kind of president who made people nostalgic for political boredom. With a grin as wide as the Ohio plains and the morals of a flapper-era gossip column, Harding came to Washington promising a return to normalcy. What he delivered was something closer to a return-to-bedroom drama. Harding didn't just have affairs. He had affairs that read like serialized soap operas, complete with secret love children, hotel rendezvous, and melodramatic letters that could make a romance novelist blush. Most infamously, he carried on a long-term relationship with Nan Britton, who later wrote a tell-all book about their trysts, including encounters in a White House closet. Harding, ever the multitasker, apparently didn't mind mixing governance with heavy petting. The irony? He was wildly popular during his life, charismatic, relatable. People saw his flaws and shrugged. He played poker, drank during Prohibition, had an affair or 2 or 5. At least he wasn't pretending to be perfect. But the real punchline came after his death. Harding passed suddenly while still in office, and the scandals, sexual and otherwise, bloomed like mold in a sealed box. The Teapot Dome affair, the backroom deals, the girlfriends. History dropped the hammer. Harding went from national sweetheart to laughingstock. His tomb in Marion, Ohio, stands proud and white and eerily grand, much like the man himself. But the stories linger in the shadows, whispered by history's archivists and thrilled historians. And now, from scandals behind closed doors, to a president who brought his absurdity into the open, literally galloping through the White House on a bizarre contraption. Let's talk about Calvin Coolidge and the electric horse he took very, very seriously. Calvin Coolidge enjoyed operating a small electric horse in the White House. If you ever imagined the presidency as a solemn, stately affair, allow Calvin Coolidge to shatter that illusion. In a room just steps from the Oval Office, The 30th President of the United States mounted what can only be described as a glorified mechanical pony, a small electric horse used for exercise and presumably deadpan amusement. And he didn't do it once as a novelty. He did it often, proudly, silently. Coolidge, dubbed Silent Cal for his near-parodic levels of reticence, wasn't known for emotional displays. But there's something almost childlike about his dedication to this absurd little device. He'd climb aboard in full suit, flick the switch, and rock back and forth in a stiff rhythm, all while aides quietly passed papers and tried very hard not to react. What makes this so deliciously Coolidge is the contrast. Here was a president famous for saying almost nothing, governing through omission, and projecting iceberg-level indifference to most things. Yet he gleefully rode an electric horse like a 1920s cowboy Luddite. It wasn't just for laughs, though. Coolidge used it for health. He believed it improved circulation and kept him fit, though fit for Coolidge meant enough energy to take a nap by noon and say no to everything with surgical precision. Still, the visual remains iconic. The most reserved president in American history, rocking back and forth on a jerky metal horse, while the machinery of government ground on in the next room. And with that image seared into your mind, let's move on to a man whose early career involved actual danger and isolation, far from the electric gadgets of Washington. Meet Herbert Hoover, the future president who once survived a deserted island stint. Herbert Hoover was once stranded on a deserted island for several weeks during his early mining career. Before the breadlines, before the Great Depression, before his name became synonymous with dust bowls and economic despair, Herbert Hoover was just a young mining engineer with an appetite for risk and a knack for being inconveniently marooned. In his early career, while surveying remote mining operations abroad, Hoover found himself stranded on a literal deserted island. Not metaphorically, not figuratively. Literally, a chunk of land surrounded by nothing but water and confusion, with no working radio and no escape plan. It wasn't romantic. There were no volleyballs named Wilson or dramatic swan dives. Just an engineer, some scattered supplies, and the vast realization that Harvard didn't prepare you for howling emptiness and questionable rations. Hoover did what he always did. Meticulously calculated, adapted, and waited. Weeks passed. He survived. Not with flair, but with quiet determination. That episode, like much of Hoover's life, is overshadowed by what came later. The collapse. The shanty towns bearing his name. The nation starving while he clung to economic theories. But those early years, the ones filled with mining contracts, foreign deserts, and accidental Robinson Crusoe reboots, tell a different story. One of a man who could endure almost anything. Almost. That's what makes his later failure so tragic. Hoover, the survivor, the problem solver, couldn't solve the problem that defined him. And maybe that's the cruel twist. Sometimes survival in youth sets you up for disappointment in legacy. Speaking of hobbies that age into personality traits, let's now move from desert islands to postage stamps. The next president turned a quiet obsession into a full-blown collecting frenzy. Yes, Franklin D. Roosevelt didn't just fight fascism, he also licked envelopes with purpose. Franklin D. Roosevelt was a passionate philatelist, stamp collector throughout his life. Franklin D. Roosevelt, the man who navigated America through the Great Depression and World War II, was also a man deeply, weirdly, sincerely in love with postage stamps. Not just as a passing childhood phase, but as a lifelong devotion. Quiet, methodical, borderline obsessive. His collection was massive. His enthusiasm was real, and while the world burned, FDR often found solace flipping through binders filled with tiny portraits and inked borders from distant lands. He didn't hide it either. Roosevelt once said that stamp collecting helped keep him sane during the most stressful periods of his presidency. While generals plotted and economies wobbled, the president could be found examining perforations and identifying postmarks. There's something almost comically understated about a wartime leader finding balance not in bourbon or billiards, but in Belgian postage. He even designed stamps himself. A sitting U.S. president with military advisors on one side and postal designers on the other, discussing shading and symmetry. The White House became a kind of philatelic think tank. But here's the real kicker. His hobby humanized him. In a role so often consumed by ego and power, stamps made FDR small in the best possible way. He wasn't just the man with the New Deal. He was the man who waited patiently for new arrivals in his mailroom like a kid on Christmas. And when he died, his collection became a symbol, not of power, but of peace. A reminder that even the most powerful need something small, predictable, and utterly personal to hold on to. Speaking of holding cards and knowing when to bluff, our next president found solace in another kind of deck, not of stamps, but of poker hands. Let's deal in Harry S. Truman and his famously high-stakes poker table. Harry S. Truman loved to play poker with his staff and visitors. When it came to leadership style, Harry S. Truman was equal parts directness and folksy charm. Like a Missouri farm boy armed with executive authority and an unshuffled deck of cards, poker wasn't just a pastime for Truman. It was practically his second cabinet. At the end of long, tension-filled days, Truman would gather staffers, friends, and sometimes even visiting dignitaries for games that blended political gossip with full-throttle bluffing. These weren't idle distractions. They were rituals. Deals were made, not just in smoke-filled back rooms, but across a green felt table where the stakes were chips, pride, and occasionally classified insights disguised as small talk. Truman kept a regular game going on train rides aboard the presidential rail car, the Ferdinand Magellan, where whiskey, cigars, and poker chips often replaced policy memos. He played hard. He rarely folded. And he didn't suffer bad losers or sanctimonious winners. Poker gave him clarity, an emotional reset, a way to read people without their rehearsed political masks. It was Truman's lie detector, his pressure valve, and occasionally his therapy session. And like everything with Truman, it had a moral undercurrent. He once remarked that poker teaches you more about people than politics ever could. Bluffing, risk-taking, timing, it was leadership in miniature. So while the world watched him drop the atomic bomb and reshape post-war Europe, Truman's closest advisors knew something else. The man could read a hand better than most, could read a telegraph. And now, from cards to claws, get ready for a White House pet that wasn't fluffy or adorable or even remotely conventional. Meet Big Tex, the armadillo who shared a residence with Lyndon B. Johnson. Lyndon B. Johnson kept a pet armadillo named Big Tex in the White House. You'd think a man with the nuclear codes and the weight of the Vietnam War on his shoulders might crave serenity, or at least something soft and comforting, like a golden retriever. But Lyndon B. Johnson, in his unfailing ability to confound expectations and double down on Texas-sized eccentricity, brought home an armadillo, a real one, named it Big Tex, and kept it as a pet at the White House. Now, there's a certain charm to this image. LBJ, all ears and elbows, watching with deadpan satisfaction as his leathery, armor-plated companion snuffles around the White House lawn. But of course, this being Johnson, it wasn't just about novelty. He liked to show Big Tex off, during photo ops, state visits, occasionally to confuse reporters. It wasn't subtle. It was performance, Texan theater wrapped in reptilian oddity. Johnson had a long-standing affection for unusual pets. He also kept beagles, hamsters, and a white rabbit named Him. But Big Tex stood out. Not just because he was weird, but because he represented something about LBJ's entire persona. Contradictory, folksy, bizarre, and strangely political. The armadillo wasn't just an animal, it was a branding strategy with claws. And like most things Johnson touched, the armadillo eventually vanished, back to Texas, or to some obscure footnote. But it remains lodged in the annals of presidential absurdity, a reminder that even the most powerful men still need something weird to keep them grounded. Speaking of strange talents, let's now turn to a president known not for his pets, but for his hands. Nimble, disciplined, and oddly melodic, they were just as skilled at pounding political opponents as they were at coaxing out music. Richard Nixon, your curtain is rising. And there's a piano waiting. Richard Nixon was an excellent debater and played the piano and accordion. Richard Nixon, paranoid, embattled, cynical mastermind of American realpolitik. But before the Watergate tapes and sweaty upper lips, he was a prodigy of sorts, especially when it came to debating and, bizarrely, music. Most know him for scowling and resigning. Few realize he could sit at a piano and play with poise, even grace. Fewer still know he could also whip out an accordion and carry a tune. And yes, he debated like a tactician and played like a lounge act. He didn't perform much publicly, because Nixon performing anything that wasn't a resignation speech always felt like a contradiction. But behind closed doors, the man had rhythm. His piano playing was self-taught, deliberate, and oddly emotional for someone with the emotional range of a filing cabinet. His accordion work? Folksy, nostalgic, and deeply at odds with his political image. As a debater, Nixon was surgical. He didn't charm, he dissected. He memorized everything. He had a lawyer's instincts and a gladiator's temperament. People underestimated him because he lacked charisma. But in a courtroom-style exchange, Nixon rarely lost. Even in the famous 1960 debates against Kennedy, where radio listeners thought he won and TV viewers crowned JFK, his performance was sharp, intellectual, and cold as steel. Together, the piano and the podium told a strange story. A man who could make music and mayhem with equal ease. Nixon wasn't likable, but he was skilled. Intensely so. The tragedy is that he used those talents to wage war on both enemies and himself. And speaking of slopes, literal ones this time, our next president never met a mogul he didn't like. Gerald Ford, clumsy in pop culture but smooth on skis, is gliding into focus next. Gerald Ford was an avid skier and enjoyed hitting the slopes. It's one of the great ironic reversals in presidential history. Gerald Ford, who pop culture crowned the klutz in chief, falling down stairs, slipping on tarmacs, bonking his head with comic timing, was in real life a graceful and enthusiastic skier. Not just a hobbyist either. A genuine lover of alpine speed, carving turns with the kind of ease and balance that made you wonder whether Saturday Night Live had mixed him up with someone else. Ford's skiing wasn't just recreational, it was habitual. He hit the slopes frequently, often in Vail, Colorado, where he maintained a home. Locals remember him as competent, fast, and generally devoid of the clumsiness that plagued his public image. On snow, he looked coordinated. In politics, less so. There's something telling about the contrast. The man could navigate a black diamond trail but couldn't descend the steps of Air Force One without media ridicule. It's almost poetic. Grace in private, pratfalls in public. Ford was the accidental president, catapulted into the Oval Office by resignation and scandal, cursed with a body that betrayed him in front of cameras. But skiing gave him something politics couldn't. Control, momentum, gravity on his side. While D.C. tangled itself in Cold War paranoia and post-Watergate recovery, Ford was out west, cutting through snow and pretending for a few hours that none of it mattered. And now, let's come in from the cold and meet a warm-hearted president with a four-legged gift for his daughter. Because what's more wholesome than a border collie named Grits? Jimmy Carter enters the scene. Peanuts, submarines, and dogs in tow. Jimmy Carter had a pet border collie named Grits, given to his daughter Amy. Of all the presidential pets, eagles, ponies, armadillos, few come with a name as unapologetically Southern as Grits. Enter Jimmy Carter, a man whose presidency was marked by crises, but whose personal life remained anchored in humility and genuine warmth. Grits, a border collie gifted to Amy Carter during their White House years, wasn't just a pet. He was a furry extension of Carter's down-home image, accessible, simple, and a little bit stubborn. Grits didn't just hang out in the Rose Garden or pose for Christmas cards. He roamed the White House grounds like he owned the place, nipping at heels and adding an occasional bark to the political discourse. Staff adored him. Amy doted on him. Secret Service probably didn't love him darting into secure areas, But what could they do? The dog had better approval ratings than most of the cabinet. Carter himself was no stranger to animals or rural living. He had grown up on a Georgia peanut farm, surrounded by livestock and simpler truths. Grits was a callback to that life, a reminder that even as helicopters hovered and hostage crises brewed, there was still a little girl and her dog playing fetch on the South Lawn. But like Carter's presidency, Grit's time in the White House was not without its hiccups. Stories of behavioral issues circulated, though few were substantiated. Eventually, Grits was sent back to Georgia, possibly because of incompatibility with the family cat. Or perhaps, like many Carter-era ideas, he was just ahead of his time. And now, let's toss that horseshoe of idealism into the next chapter, because the next president wasn't about pastoral peace or peanuts. He was about precision throws and quiet competition. Meet George H.W. Bush and the game he played like a seasoned champ, Horseshoes. George H.W. Bush loved to play horseshoes. If diplomacy is the art of strategic positioning, then George H.W. Bush's favorite sport might have been the perfect metaphor. Horseshoes, simple, American, deceptively competitive, was the game he loved most. Not golf, not baseball, horseshoes. The kind of sport played in backyards and county fairs, where grace doesn't matter, but accuracy does. Bush didn't just dabble in it, he dominated. Installed just outside the White House, the horseshoe pit became his informal war room. Staffers, senators, foreign dignitaries, no one was safe from the clink of iron against stake and the unassuming ruthlessness of a friendly game. Bush was known to wager small bets, keep mental scorecards, and celebrate victories with a quiet, satisfied grin. He threw with the calm confidence of a man who knew that missing the mark, even by inches, was just unacceptable. The symbolism practically writes itself. Bush Sr., the CIA veteran and Navy pilot, preferred subtlety over flash. He didn't throw hard, he threw smart, like his foreign policy, like his speeches. The horseshoe pit was where he could disarm allies and adversaries alike, using sport as diplomacy, iron arcs as icebreakers. And yes, there's something old school about it. It's hard to imagine a modern president competing in a sport so rooted in rural Americana, but that's what made Bush different. He was a throwback, gentle, aristocratic, fiercely competitive behind a soft handshake. From the stakes in the yard to the stakes of Desert Storm, the metaphor never felt far away. But speaking of charm, unpolished, potent, and personal, we now arrive at a president who could disarm a room not with sport, but with uncanny memory and relentless empathy. Let's slide into the magnetic world of Bill Clinton, where names were remembered and hearts were often stolen. Bill Clinton is known for his ability to connect with people on a personal level, often remembering their names years later. There are glad-handers, and then there's Bill Clinton. The man didn't just shake hands, he absorbed you. He'd lock eyes, lean in, and suddenly your childhood trauma and your cousin's bar mitzvah were somehow his business. And the next time you met him, 2 years, 4 scandals, and a global summit later, he'd remember your name. Not because a staffer whispered it, not because it was on a name tag, because somewhere in that slippery, scandal-ridden brain of his, you were logged. Clinton's memory for people wasn't just impressive, it was weaponized empathy. Staffers called it the Clinton Vortex. He could walk into a room of 500 strangers and leave with 499 convinced they were old friends. It wasn't magic, it was technique. He listened, actively. He asked questions with the intensity of a man auditioning to be your therapist, your pastor, and your drinking buddy, all at once. And it wasn't always innocent. That level of charm, unchecked, curdled into manipulation, into over-familiarity, into the slippery slope of blurred lines. But the root skill, the memory, the connection, remained astonishing. In politics, charisma is currency, and Clinton minted it like a central bank. He made you feel seen, heard, understood, and that's dangerous. Because when someone can make you feel like the center of the universe, they can also use that gravity to warp everything else around them. Now, from charisma on the fairway to charisma lost in the rough. Let's head to a president who tried the same human touch but traded empathy for golf etiquette. Barack Obama is next, and the fairways were never quite the same. Barack Obama enjoys playing golf, though he admits he's not very good. For a man who carried himself with poetic cadence, political precision, and a wardrobe that never wrinkled, Barack Obama's golf game was less refined. He loved the sport, no doubt about that, but he never claimed to be good at it, which in its own way was refreshing. A president whose ego could command Nobel Prizes and presidential libraries, yet still chuckle at a slice into the rough. It's an oddly disarming contrast. Obama hit the golf course frequently during his presidency, drawing criticism from the usual suspects for playing too much, as if presidential leadership were a 9-to-5 job with no lunch break. But for Obama, golf wasn't escapism, it was ritual. A place to breathe, to think, to trash-talk advisors in khakis. His swing was deliberate, his form stiff, his follow-through occasionally tragic. But the man loved the game, flaws and all. There's a certain honesty in that. While some presidents played to impress, gritting teeth for the cameras, Obama played because he genuinely liked the rhythm of it. The pacing, the mental game, the strategic patience. You can see the connection. The same mind that calculated diplomatic timing also pondered the arc of a Titleist 4 against a cloudy sky, and yet he never improved much. And that never seemed to bother him. He played with world leaders, childhood friends, and Secret Service agents, rarely letting the score matter more than the conversation. But now we pivot from a president who played hard and laughed harder to one who lived under a stricter code. One that didn't permit vices or indulgences. Say what you want about him, but Donald Trump's body is a temple of surprising restraint. No cigarettes, no alcohol, just pure, unfiltered Trump. Donald Trump has never smoked a cigarette or consumed alcohol. In a country built on rebellion and bourbon, Donald Trump, walking paradox, headline generator, spray-tan cyclone, has never touched a drop of alcohol or lit a single cigarette. Not once. No wine with dinner. No celebratory champagne. No late-night cigars. The man who once licensed vodka under his own name never drank a sip of it. That's not just branding. That's personal policy. And strangely, moral clarity. The reason is as tragic as it is telling. Trump's older brother, Fred Jr., died from alcoholism, an open wound that left a very real, very human mark on the younger Trump. From that moment forward, abstinence wasn't a virtue, it was armor, a vow. In a life defined by excess, gold towers, beauty pageants, fast food feasts, this particular restraint is startlingly sober, even admirable. What makes it fascinating isn't the abstinence itself. Plenty of presidents didn't drink, but none have been more synonymous with indulgence, appetite, and ego than Trump. He lives loud. He eats cheeseburgers on Air Force One. He brags about wealth like it's a sacrament. And yet, through it all, no vodka, no cigarettes, just Diet Coke, by the dozen. His followers see it as discipline. His critics call it performative. But somewhere in that contradiction lies the closest thing to an unshakable principle. You can question his policies, his tweets, his ties, but not his sobriety. It's one of the few things about him that doesn't shift with the wind. And now, from a man who abstains from indulgence to one who refused ceremonial grandeur altogether, George Washington didn't want your Excellency. He preferred plain old Mr. President. Let's go back to the beginning, where humility wore powdered wigs and revolutionaries set the tone. George Washington famously refused to be called His Excellency or His Highness. George Washington was the kind of man who could have worn a crown and had people nod along like it made perfect sense. But he didn't. In fact, he actively refused the trappings of monarchy with a stubbornness that's become a core part of his mythology. When Congress debated what to call the new leader of the freshly minted republic, suggestions like His Excellency and even His Highness the President of the United States of America and protector of their liberties were tossed around. And Washington, famously austere, said no. Not just no, but a resounding, awkward, fatherly no. He wanted to be called, Mr. President. Nothing more. No frills, no throne. Just a title that made it clear he worked for the people, not the other way around. And for a man who'd spent years at the head of armies and on the cusp of empire, it was more than modesty. It was a message. This refusal shaped the presidency forever. It established that power in America would wear plain clothes and speak with common names, even if it wielded uncommon influence. Washington knew what Europe looked like: powdered wigs, royal courts, divine rights. He wanted none of that. He had seen kings up close and found them lacking. So he killed the idea before it could take root here. Of course, the irony is that by refusing the crown, he made himself more kingly in the American imagination. The man who would not be king became one in myth. Now let's turn from restraint to intimacy. The founding father who wrote as much with his heart as with his head. Because next is John Adams, and if you think political love letters can't change the world, just ask Abigail. John Adams often wrote letters to his wife, Abigail, discussing politics and family matters. Before there were texts, tweets, or press briefings, there were the letters, handwritten, ink-blotted, urgent in their tenderness. And no presidential correspondence ever crackled with more honesty and affection than the missives exchanged between John Adams and his wife, Abigail. Their letters weren't just personal. They were political, intellectual, and deeply revealing. Theirs was a marriage of minds and missions. Adams poured out his worries, his triumphs, his anxieties about war, governance, and the fragile state of the Union into these letters. Abigail responded with wit, wisdom, and sharp-edged advice. She wasn't just a sounding board, she was his conscience. In many ways, Abigail Adams was the country's first unofficial co-president, shaping ideas and steadying the man behind the revolution. Their exchanges covered everything from constitutional theory to the price of pins. In between treaty updates and warnings about French influence, there were professions of love, longing, and domestic details. She kept him grounded. He kept her informed. Together, they built a record of America's birth through the eyes of two people inextricably tied to each other and the experiment they helped shape. Adams didn't need a speechwriter. He had Abigail. And their legacy isn't just engraved in marble. It's inked across hundreds of deeply human, often heartbreaking letters. From lovers in ink to lovers of invention, we now move to the man whose brain never stopped tinkering. If Adams wrote with emotion, Thomas Jefferson designed with vision, even down to the chair he sat in. Get ready for some swivel. Literally. Thomas Jefferson designed the swivel chair. Thomas Jefferson didn't just pen the Declaration of Independence. He probably spun around a few times while doing it. The swivel chair, that now ubiquitous piece of office furniture, traces its origin back to Monticello, where Jefferson, part philosopher, part furniture tinkerer, decided sitting still was simply too static. True to form, he didn't just commission a chair. He re-engineered one. Taking a standard Windsor-style chair, Jefferson added a central iron spindle that allowed it to rotate. The result? A functional rotating seat of contemplation, perfect for drafting revolutions and pondering Enlightenment philosophy while literally spinning in circles. Yes, the man who wrote Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness wanted to do it with ergonomic flair. Jefferson's swivel chair is more than a fun fact. It's a symbol of how he approached everything, government, architecture, even furniture, as a system to be improved. He didn't just live in Monticello, he designed it. He didn't just write laws, he designed the tools to sit and think them through. The chair is Jefferson in miniature, elegant, innovative, and quietly disruptive. And it worked. Legend holds that he used the prototype to draft parts of the Declaration, which means the most important words in American political history might have been written mid-swivel. Try getting that kind of motion into the Constitutional Convention. From a man who engineered liberty into everything he touched, we now pivot, pun very much intended, to a man whose small, sickly frame belied a mind that helped structure the entire country. James Madison, next up, wasn't just the father of the Constitution. He was also the last of its signers to survive. James Madison was the last surviving signer of the U.S. Constitution. James Madison wasn't the loudest voice in the room, nor the tallest man at the table. Quite the opposite. At barely over 5 feet tall and often frail, he seemed more suited for a quiet academic life than the brutal arenas of early American politics. And yet, this soft-spoken constitutional scholar outlived them all. By the time he died in 1836, Madison was the last living signer of the U.S. Constitution, a walking, wheezing relic of a moment the rest of the country was already mythologizing. While others aged into statues and hagiographies, Madison stuck around. He watched the Constitution he helped craft get stretched, misinterpreted, challenged, and worshipped. He saw political parties form around ideologies he'd once tried to balance with nuanced phrasing and footnotes. He saw war, scandal, expansion. He saw the experiment wobble, but not fall. Madison's longevity isn't just a trivia footnote. It's a ghostly echo. Imagine being the last survivor of a revolution, wandering through a country that had already turned your life's work into a patriotic bedtime story. He saw his fellow founders turned into marble men, while he spent his twilight years fielding letters, clarifying clauses, and quietly worrying about the Republic's soul. He died in his Virginia home, surrounded by papers, debt, and the uneasy sense that America might still get everything horribly wrong. His last words, supposedly he was waiting for an appointment that never came, which, for the man who built the framework of government, feels darkly appropriate. And speaking of frameworks under pressure, we now turn to a man who signed compromise into law with a pen as heavy as a powder keg. James Monroe's successor had to hold the Union together with legal duct tape, and James Monroe himself had already laid the groundwork with a decision that would echo forever. James Monroe signed the Missouri Compromise into law. James Monroe's presidency was called the Era of Good Feelings, which is historical branding at its finest. Because buried beneath the surface of unity and post-war optimism was a ticking time bomb with a Southern drawl and a Northern conscience. And Monroe, stoic and measured, held the match and the fuse in each hand. When he signed the Missouri Compromise into law in 1820, he wasn't solving a problem. He was postponing a reckoning. The compromise allowed Missouri to enter the Union as a slave state while admitting Maine as a free state, preserving the delicate balance in Congress. It also drew an invisible line, latitude 36°30, across the Louisiana Territory. North of it, slavery would be prohibited. South of it, permitted. It was cartography as political triage. Monroe didn't write the legislation, but he owned its consequences. He saw it as a necessary evil, a pressure valve for the young republic. What he couldn't have seen, or maybe what he refused to admit, was that the compromise wasn't a resolution. It was a delay, a pause button. And every time that line was tested, the country grew more brittle. He was calm through it all, unmoved, pragmatic, lawyerly. His goal wasn't moral clarity, it was political stability. And for a while it worked. The Union held. The economy thrived. Monroe's approval rating soared, though no one called it that yet. But history, unlike politics, doesn't forget the costs of delay. The Missouri Compromise was the first in a long string of legislative band-aids stretched over a wound that would eventually burst open in Civil War. And next, from constitutional fractures to icy dips, we move from a man who navigated sectional crises to one who skinny dipped in the Potomac like it was his personal spa. Yes, it's time to meet John Quincy Adams, the original cold plunge philosopher president. John Quincy Adams was known for his daily habit of taking a dip in the Potomac River, often nude. John Quincy Adams, Harvard scholar, diplomat, son of a president, also happened to be Washington, D.C.'s most dedicated nude swimmer. Every morning, often before dawn, he would wade into the Potomac River, stripping off his clothes and diving in with all the reverence of a monk entering a sacred ritual. In an era before indoor plumbing, Adams wasn't just bathing. He was meditating, thinking, shedding the burdens of politics and garments alike. And this wasn't a secret. It was well known in Washington society, and even more infamous after one journalist, Anne Royal, reportedly cornered him during one of his swims, sat on his clothes, and refused to move until he granted her an interview. Whether it's fully true or not hardly matters. History loves a good image. The dips weren't just for hygiene or headlines. Adams believed in physical discipline, in stoic discomfort, in the philosophical cleanse. Cold water was his daily baptism, washing away the grime of politics, if not the sins. This quirk adds a strange texture to Adams, a man known otherwise for rigid principles and intellectual density. He was awkward in conversation, stubborn in diplomacy, and deeply misanthropic in style. But in that river, alone, naked, and shivering, he was free. He wasn't the Secretary of State. He wasn't the sixth president. He was just a man floating in cold water, hoping to outswim the madness of his time. From aquatic philosophers to bulletproof legends, our next president didn't just duel his enemies. He let them shoot him in the chest and kept going. Andrew Jackson is up next, and he brought blood to the ballot box long before Twitter wars. Andrew Jackson survived a duel where he was shot in the chest, carrying the bullet for the rest of his life. Andrew Jackson wasn't just a president, he was a full-blown Western myth trapped in a political suit. Before he ever took office, he fought in wars, slaughtered enemies, and turned vendettas into art. But nothing embodies the psychotic romance of the Jacksonian era, quite like the time he got shot in the chest in a duel and kept standing. It was over a slight against his wife, which in Jackson's world was grounds for blood. His opponent, Charles Dickinson, was a known marksman. Jackson, already carrying a constellation of wounds from various conflicts, knew the odds. But strategy, not bravado, carried the day. Jackson let Dickinson fire first, absorbing the bullet square in the ribs, a move equal parts suicidal and theatrical. Then, with blood soaking through his coat, he calmly raised his own pistol, aimed, and fired. Dickinson dropped. Jackson didn't. Doctors later advised that removing the bullet would kill him. So it stayed, festering, aching, a pulsing reminder under his scarred skin for the rest of his life. He carried it like a second heart, made of lead. Jackson's body became a map of violence, war wounds, dueling injuries, and the kind of scars you collect when you treat every disagreement like a showdown at high noon. He turned pain into policy. His presidency was loud, vengeful, populist, and deeply paranoid. And the bullet? It became legend. Proof that he was too stubborn, too angry, too indestructible to die on cue. Speaking of cues, our next president posed for one of history's earliest photo ops, back when cameras took forever and everyone looked haunted. Meet Martin Van Buren, the first photographed POTUS and the origin story behind a word you say every day. Martin Van Buren was the first president to be photographed while in office. Martin Van Buren might not be the flashiest entry in presidential lore. He lacked Lincoln's gravitas, Jackson's menace, or Jefferson's architectural flair, but what he did have was something strangely modern, a preserved image. He was the first sitting president to be captured by the camera, which at the time was a cumbersome machine that required patience, stillness, and the willingness to look like a ghost trapped in molasses. The resulting photograph is haunting, in the way all early photography is. Van Buren's features are sunken, his eyes unblinking, his hair tufted like a weary owl's. But that image sealed him into the public memory in a way his policies never could. While others faded into paintings and engravings, Van Buren became pixelated permanence. This was more than just a novelty. It was a shift. The presidency was entering an age where visibility would slowly start to matter more than virtue. The man who once sat beside Jackson, managing political chaos with cunning and compromise, was now staring into a lens that would outlive him. Image had arrived. Van Buren's actual presidency was tangled in economic panic and political factionalism. But none of that appears in the photo. There, he's just a man. Still, aging, shadowed, frozen forever in a medium that hadn't yet learned to flatter. And speaking of freezing to death in plain sight, let's now talk about a man who gave the longest inaugural address in history in the middle of a freezing storm, with no coat, no hat, and no apparent regard for the laws of thermodynamics. William Henry Harrison's presidency was brief, but it burned out in a truly ridiculous blaze of hypothermic glory. William Henry Harrison refused to wear a coat or hat during his lengthy inaugural address in cold, wet weather, possibly contributing to his fatal illness. William Henry Harrison had something to prove. At 68, he was the oldest president ever elected at the time, and he wasn't about to let anyone think he was too old, too weak, or too soft. So on a cold, wet March day in 1841, he stepped up to the podium for his inaugural address, stripped of hat, coat, or any common sense, and began to speak. For nearly 2 hours, in the rain, wind whipping, cold sinking in, as if mortality were something he could filibuster. The speech was a tome, an hour and 45 minutes of classical references, verbose patriotism, and dense philosophical wax. It was a defiant attempt to project vigor, to tell the nation, I am still strong, I am not my age, I am not my ailments. And then, barely a month later, he was dead. The cause is still debated. Pneumonia? Maybe. Typhoid? Possibly. But the legend, of course, prefers the clean version, that he got sick from the speech, that pride, or stubbornness, or political theater, killed him. And honestly, it's believable. History often isn't what actually happened. It's what we're willing to remember. Harrison's presidency lasted just 31 days, the shortest in U.S. history. Long enough to deliver a speech. Not long enough to do much else. His legacy? A cautionary tale about vanity, weather, and the limits of dramatic effect. But if Harrison was undone by a speech, his successor outlived even the 19th century, and, in an absurd twist, left behind a lineage that's still shockingly alive. Get ready for John Tyler, a man with 15 children and 2 grandsons still kicking around nearly 180 years later. John Tyler had a significant age gap with his second wife, Julia, who was 30 years his junior. John Tyler, America's first unelected president, constitutional oddity, and human footnote, also happened to be a full-time romantic, with the marriage resume to prove it. His first wife, Letitia, died during his presidency. Then came Julia Gardner. She was 22. He was 52, 30 years apart. The ink on her debutante card was barely dry when she became First Lady. Julia didn't just marry into history, she marched into it, high society bonnet and all. Tyler was smitten, aggressively so. After proposing multiple times and being denied, he finally wore her down following a tragic incident aboard a naval ship where her father was killed in an explosion. Amid the national mourning, Tyler made his move. Classy, right? When they married in 1844, eyebrows didn't just raise, they vanished. Washington society clutched its pearls. Newspapers couldn't resist. Tyler, dubbed His Excellency for assuming office after Harrison's death, now added scandal magnet to his resume. Yet the union, bizarre as it seemed, endured. Julia relished her role, bringing pomp and flair to the White House. Tyler? He fathered 7 more children with her. Yes, 7. On top of the 8 he already had. This wasn't just marriage, it was a repopulation campaign. And that's what makes Tyler's story so ridiculously immortal. As of 2024, 2 of his grandsons, yes, grandsons, were still alive. How? Because one of his children, Lyon Gardner Tyler Sr., had kids late in life. And one of those kids did the same. It's not genetics, it's just pure chronological gymnastics. But if Tyler's legacy is a strangely persistent family tree, his successors was pure grit. Meet James K. Polk, The president who worked so hard he practically vaporized, taking minimal holidays, sleeping little, and dying just months after leaving office. James K. Polk had a strong work ethic and was known for working long hours, rarely taking holidays. James K. Polk wasn't here to party. He wasn't here to charm. He wasn't even really here to live. He was here to work. Relentlessly, obsessively, to the point where even his admirers had to admit, the man had no chill. He promised to serve only one term, achieve 4 major goals, and then vanish. And that's exactly what he did. Except the vanish part turned out to be permanent. Polk worked like the presidency was a 24/7 emergency room. He skipped holidays, ignored leisure, and treated breaks as a personal failing. His White House ran like a machine, efficient, joyless, and unrelenting. He expanded the country by 1/3, lowered tariffs, reformed the banking system, and fought a war with Mexico. But ask anyone who worked for him, and they'd likely remember the insomnia more than the legacy. His schedule was brutal. Morning meetings bled into midnight notes. He micromanaged everything. His own wife, Sarah, served as unofficial chief of staff because she was the only one who could tolerate his pace. The man didn't govern. He consumed governance. And then, when his term ended, he collapsed. Literally, he left office in March 1849 and died that June. 3 months. That's all he lasted. Like a candle that had burned from both ends and then decided to torch the table for good measure. Polk didn't want immortality. He wanted results. He got them. But history, always the indifferent roommate, doesn't hand out awards for burnout. Just footnotes. And speaking of unexpected career paths, the next president had never held elected office before entering the White House. No politics, just uniforms, orders, and an absurdly casual wardrobe. Zachary Taylor, the farmer dress general, is charging into view. Zachary Taylor was a career military officer and had never held political office before the presidency. Zachary Taylor's resume read like a cannon blast. 40 years in uniform, multiple wars, a reputation for toughness that preceded him like smoke before fire, and not a single day in elected office before he landed in the most powerful position in the country. He was, in essence, America's experiment in letting a battlefield general skip the line, straight from warhorse to White House. Taylor wasn't a politician. He didn't know how to give speeches. He didn't have a party platform. He didn't even vote until he was 62. His political opinions were less coherent policy and more vague hunches. But what he did have was a face made for folk hero status and a reputation for winning. The Whigs grabbed him like a shiny new weapon and pointed him at Washington. And Taylor, for all his military discipline, governed like a man bewildered by the fine print. He hated compromise, distrusted career politicians, and didn't care for the slavery debate slowly ripping the country apart. Until he did. And when he did, he surprised everyone. The slave-owning general from Louisiana began leaning toward preserving the Union at any cost. But his presidency, like his sentences, didn't last long. Just 16 months in office before sudden illness cut him down. Some blamed bad water. Others blamed cherries and milk. A few whispered darker theories. What's certain is that his outsider experiment ended the way many outsider experiments do, abruptly. And speaking of strange origins, his successor was even less prepared, especially in the literacy department. Next up, meet Millard Fillmore, a man who didn't learn to read until adulthood, yet still clawed his way into the Oval Office with sheer, silent determination. Millard Fillmore had a difficult childhood and only learned to read at age 18. Millard Fillmore's path to the presidency wasn't paved. It was clawed through backwoods hardship and sheer willpower. Born into crushing poverty in upstate New York, he grew up in a one-room cabin without heat, books, or the luxury of idle thought. His father was a tenant farmer who leased land from other poor men. The Fillmores were so low on the social ladder they couldn't even see the bottom rung. By age 14, Fillmore was apprenticed to a clothmaker, a job that involved more backbreaking labor than education. He had no formal schooling, no mentors, no money. But he had something dangerously rare in a republic built on meritocracy, stubbornness. He taught himself to read, laboring over borrowed books by firelight, tracing out words with calloused fingers like they were buried treasure. At 18, he could finally read and write fluently, and from there, he didn't stop. He studied law, climbed through the ranks, and eventually helped found what would become the University at Buffalo. He became a congressman, then vice president, then, upon Zachary Taylor's death, president. His rise is often mocked because, let's be honest, the name Millard Fillmore sounds more like a regional accountant than a historical heavyweight. But behind that beige exterior was a truly American story. A man who started with nothing, literally couldn't read, and ended up in the highest office in the land. Still, for all his bootstrap valor, Fillmore's presidency was defined by compromises that aged like milk. He signed the Fugitive Slave Act and paved the way for deeper national division. The man who once couldn't read ended up helping write one of the darkest chapters of pre-Civil War policy. And now, we tumble into the tragic legacy of his successor, Franklin Pierce, a man haunted by heartbreak, scandal, and the ghosts of 3 lost children. Franklin Pierce's family was plagued by tragedy. All 3 of his children died young. Franklin Pierce's life reads less like a political career and more like an extended tragedy in formal wear. Before he ever took office, the 14th President of the United States had already buried 2 of his children. The third, and last, died in a horrific train accident just weeks before Pierce's inauguration, right in front of his eyes. The boy, Benjamin, was just 11 years old. The accident left the Pierces shattered. Jane Pierce, already reclusive and melancholic, withdrew completely. She blamed the presidency for their son's death, convinced it was divine punishment for Franklin's ambition. Franklin himself spiraled into a fog of grief, guilt, and alcohol. His presidency began under a literal pall: mourning clothes, silence, and letters to a dead son written from the executive mansion. What followed was a presidency mired in moral paralysis. Pierce championed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, effectively reopening the slavery debate and hurling the nation toward civil war. He saw himself as a unifier, but governed like a ghost, detached, compromised, and profoundly alone. History often remembers his administration as one of the most disastrous, not just for its failures, but for its eerie inertia. It's hard to lead a nation when you're still sitting beside the coffin. Franklin Pierce didn't seek re-election. He left office despised and didn't recover. His wife remained in mourning until her death. He drank more, traveled less. He once said, "There's nothing left to do but get drunk." And so he did. And now, from a man broken by personal loss, we shift to a man broken by political failure. The only president from Pennsylvania whose bachelor status couldn't distract from the national crisis that bloomed under his watch. James Buchanan is waiting, and so is the secession. James Buchanan was the only president from Pennsylvania. James Buchanan's presidency is like a cautionary tale told by the ghost of compromise past. He was the only president hailing from Pennsylvania, a state that straddled the Mason-Dixon line both geographically and ideologically. A fitting birthplace for a man who would come to embody the worst version of neutrality. Buchanan didn't just fail to stop the Civil War. He practically watched it blossom like a slow-motion car crash, politely declining to steer or scream. Born in a log cabin in Cove Gap, Buchanan was a career politician with a resume as long as a train manifest. Congressman, senator, diplomat, secretary of state, ambassador. He was competent, smooth, and utterly obsessed with constitutional legality. When the country began fracturing along the lines of slavery, he insisted that the Constitution didn't grant him the authority to intervene, even as Southern states openly prepared to secede. He saw the storm coming and chose to comment on the weather. Historians often rank him among the worst presidents, not because he was evil or incompetent, but because he was passive at precisely the moment when action was required. His desire to preserve peace resulted in paralysis. Buchanan never married. the only lifelong bachelor to occupy the office. Washington gossiped endlessly about his relationship with William Rufus King, but the real scandal was his presidency's utter vacancy. He handed the flaming wreckage of the Union to Abraham Lincoln like a man passing off an inconvenient parcel. "Here," his silence seemed to say, "do something with this." Speaking of unlikely heroes rising from political ash heaps, let's turn now to a rail-thin lawyer from Illinois. Because Abraham Lincoln didn't just save the Union, he also nearly became a professional wrestler. Time to step into the ring. Abraham Lincoln was a skilled wrestler and boxer in his youth. Long before he was the great emancipator, Abraham Lincoln was just a tall, lanky frontier kid with a knack for throwing grown men to the dirt. He wasn't a brawler, he was a technician. In his youth, Lincoln built a reputation in Illinois for being nearly impossible to pin. He had the reach of a windmill and the balance of a cat on a rail fence. The man could fight, and more importantly, he fought fair, which made him terrifying. Lincoln wasn't just casually good. He was formally recognized. He lost only one recorded match out of hundreds, earning a local championship title and even an informal invitation to join the U.S. Wrestling Hall of Fame, granted posthumously, of course. And while his political opponents mocked his backwoods roots, no one dared suggest he couldn't physically defend himself. His wrestling was metaphorical before it became literal. Lincoln knew how to grapple with ideas, men, and mobs. Boxing came naturally too, though he preferred wrestling. There was something about leverage, about patience, about waiting for the right moment to flip your opponent, traits that would serve him well in the political arena. Lincoln's humor, sharp tongue, and storytelling were often credited for his persuasive powers, but his physical dominance was also a tool of early diplomacy. Picture it, a man with a stovepipe hat and gangly limbs settling disputes not with words, but with a well-timed hip throw. He wasn't just tall, he was imposing, and that aura, half philosopher, half farmyard titan, followed him into every room. Now let's shift from fists to indictments. Up next is a man who was also thrown out, though not by physical force. Andrew Johnson didn't just face hostility, he faced impeachment. Again. Let's return to the tailor-turned-president, who couldn't tailor peace even if he sewed it himself. Andrew Johnson was the only president to be impeached by the House of Representatives. He was acquitted by the Senate. Andrew Johnson was a man who entered the White House on the worst of terms and promptly made everything worse. Thrust into the presidency after Lincoln's assassination, Johnson inherited the fractured remains of a country that had barely stopped bleeding. And with the scalpel of compromise in one hand and the cudgel of arrogance in the other, he attempted to heal the nation by making Reconstruction as lenient as possible for the South. Congress didn't just disagree, they declared war. Johnson, a Southern Democrat who stayed loyal to the Union, thought he was the right man to reconcile the North and South. Instead, he treated the radical Republicans in Congress like rebellious children, vetoed civil rights legislation, and openly opposed the 14th Amendment. His vision of unity was really a slow-motion surrender to the Confederacy's remnants. The tipping point came when he violated the Tenure of Office Act by firing Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Congress saw this as a breach of law, a technical trap maybe, but one that they were more than happy to spring. The House impeached him. The Senate came within a single vote of removing him from office. He survived, but just barely. His presidency limped to the finish line, disgraced and ineffective. He didn't run for re-election. He barely spoke. He returned to Tennessee and in a final act of bizarre persistence actually managed to win a Senate seat years later, becoming the only former president to serve in the Senate post-presidency. But impeachment scars don't fade. Johnson's trial didn't just stain his legacy. It created a template for future constitutional crises. And with that bruised ego still echoing, we pivot to a man whose run-ins with the law were slightly more comedic. Yes, Ulysses S. Grant once arrested himself. Ulysses S. Grant once arrested a speeding carriage driver who turned out to be himself. There are few things more perfectly absurd than a president arresting himself. But Ulysses S. Grant, Civil War hero and 18th President of the United States, somehow made it happen. Proof that history is, at its core, an elaborate farce with a great wardrobe. The story goes like this. While serving as president, Grant had a penchant for fast horses and even faster carriages. Washington, D.C. at the time was filled with rickety roads, pedestrians with zero awareness, and laws designed to prevent exactly the sort of fun Grant enjoyed. One day, he was pulled over by a D.C. police officer named William H. West for speeding through the streets in his horse-drawn carriage. Grant, casually dressed and riding high, didn't pull rank. He didn't flash a badge or deliver a lecture. He simply accepted the citation and was arrested. Yes, arrested. The officer, unaware at first that he was detaining the sitting president, quickly realized who he had in the reins. But Grant insisted the law was the law. He paid the fine, commended the officer's professionalism, and continued his day. No scandal, no tantrum, just quiet accountability. A rare and endearing presidential footnote. The story has the charm of a lost Twain short story. Grant, the man who once crushed Confederate forces with military precision, being humbled by a city cop with a badge and a rule book. It's almost too perfect, the war hero surrendering, this time, to local traffic law. But let's now shift from hoofbeats to house cats, or something close. Because our next president brought not just foreign diplomacy to the White House, but also a feline curiosity from abroad. Get ready for Rutherford B Hayes and the arrival of America's very first Siamese cat. Rutherford B Hayes introduced the first Siamese cat to the United States, given to him by a diplomat. If presidential pets are reflections of their owners, then Rutherford B Hayes, stoic, unflashy, morally upright, somehow managed to have one of the most exotic and surprising firsts in White House animal history. During his presidency, he became the first American to host a Siamese cat on U.S. soil. The cat, a diplomatic gift from the American consul in Bangkok, arrived by ship, confused, aloof, and presumably furious after a transoceanic journey in a wooden crate. Its name was Siam, because the 19th century wasn't known for subtlety. The feline quickly became a White House sensation. With its slender frame, piercing blue eyes, and air of regal disdain, Siam wandered the executive mansion like it had inherited the place. Visitors were baffled. Staff were enchanted. Hayes himself was reportedly charmed by the creature's imperious demeanor. It was a weird flex, but it worked. While Hayes is often dismissed as a transitional president, a man who smoothed things over between Reconstruction and the Gilded Age, his taste in pets was ahead of its time. Siam symbolized more than quirky animal diplomacy. It hinted at America's growing curiosity with the East, with global trade, and with collecting the strange and symbolic. Sadly, Siam didn't live long. Most animals shipped across the world in the 1800s didn't. But the novelty stuck. Today, Siamese cats are one of the most popular breeds in the country, and their American origin story begins bizarrely with a man better remembered for ending Reconstruction. And speaking of presidents with unexpected side gigs, our next entry is less exotic but infinitely more cerebral. James A. Garfield didn't just know the Pythagorean theorem, he wrote his own proof of it. Let's dive into the triangle-loving mind of a president whose sharp intellect came with a tragically short shelf life. James A. Garfield invented a mathematical proof for the Pythagorean theorem. James A. Garfield wasn't just a president. He was a polymath in a waistcoat. A former college president, linguist, Civil War general, and reluctant politician, Garfield carried the vibe of a man who would rather be grading essays than leading nations. But before he was shot down by a disgruntled office seeker, he left behind one particularly nerdy legacy. A unique mathematical proof of the Pythagorean theorem. Yes, the same Garfield who was president for just 200 days also managed to contribute to geometry. In 1876, while serving in Congress, he published a simple but elegant proof of the ancient theorem that relates the sides of a right triangle. Using a clever trapezoid construction, Garfield's version stood out for its accessibility and brevity. Two things his presidency, unfortunately, did not get to enjoy. What makes it more astonishing is that Garfield wasn't trying to impress anyone. Math was just something he liked. He read Greek and Latin for fun. He could write with both hands simultaneously in different languages. He viewed intellectual rigor not as a campaign asset, but as a way of being. His mind was wired for structure, for logic, and it showed, whether in political debates or mathematical deductions. This brain power made his assassination feel especially cruel. Shot by Charles Guiteau, a man rejected for a patronage job, Garfield lingered for months while doctors probed his body with unwashed hands and Victorian overconfidence. In the end, he died not just from a bullet, but from the failures of medicine and ambition. From triangles and tragedy, we now veer toward the quieter corners of grief. Chester A. Arthur, Garfield's accidental successor, governed while cloaked in sorrow and never remarried. Let's explore the loneliness at the heart of a polished presidency. Chester A. Arthur was a widower for his entire presidency. Chester A. Arthur didn't want to be president. That's not speculation, it's biography. Elevated to the office after James A. Garfield's assassination, Arthur stepped into power carrying two heavy burdens: a nation in mourning and a heart still shattered by personal loss. His wife, Ellen Nell Herndon Arthur, had died of pneumonia nearly 2 years before he assumed the presidency. She never saw him become president, and he never stopped grieving her. Arthur was known for his elegance, sharp suits, polished demeanor, immaculate sideburns. But beneath the polished surface was a man haunted by absence. He remained a widower throughout his term, and it showed. He had a stained glass window installed in St. John's Episcopal Church in her memory and visited it often. His White House was subdued, almost funereal. The First Lady's social responsibilities were taken on by his sister, but the air never quite filled the void. Unlike other presidents who navigated office with spouses at their side, advising, softening, grounding, Arthur was alone in the spotlight, performing formality without warmth. And yet, some argue that solitude tempered him. Known previously as a political crony, Arthur stunned critics by embracing civil service reform, cutting ties with corrupt allies, and running an administration that was unexpectedly clean. Grief made him quieter, dignified, less ambitious, more humane. Arthur didn't run for re-election. He left the White House subdued, suffering from kidney disease, and lived only 2 more years. His presidency, like his personal life, was marked by understated resilience and unspoken sorrow. From morning suits to mustaches, we now pivot to another president known for grooming, not policy. Grover Cleveland's facial hair was a character in itself, and history remembers it almost as vividly as his split terms. Grover Cleveland had a walrus mustache that was quite distinctive. Grover Cleveland's mustache wasn't just facial hair, it was a national landmark. Thick, drooping, and magnificently old-fashioned, it sat beneath his nose like a weighted blanket of executive masculinity. In the age before high-definition TV or Twitter memes, Cleveland's walrus mustache did the heavy lifting of political branding. It gave him a look that said, "Yes, I can veto your bill and tell bedtime stories in the same breath." This was a man who, visually and temperamentally, seemed carved from oak. Stoic, massive, unsmiling. And the mustache added to the sense of permanence. It didn't twitch. It didn't move. It simply existed, unchallenged and unchallenged able. Cleveland's politics mirrored his grooming, conservative, blunt, unapologetic. He vetoed more bills than any president before him. He hated waste. He was allergic to sentimentality. But his mustache, that was sentimental. That was flair. That was a Victorian punctuation mark on an otherwise Puritan sentence. He served 2 non-consecutive terms, becoming the only U.S. president to do so. In between, he got married in the White House, the only president to do that too, and maintained a public image that leaned more on moral gravitas than charm. And always, the mustache remained. Steady, somber, sort of magnificent. Even now, he's remembered as the one with the mustache in bar trivia circles. It's not inaccurate. Sometimes legacy clings to symbols, and Cleveland's mustache is as much a monument to 19th century presidential style as the stovepipe hat is to Lincoln. Next up, we lighten the mood with a man whose presidency sparked literal lights. Benjamin Harrison didn't just flip a switch, he installed one, and the results were both illuminating and mildly terrifying. Let's walk into the first electrified White House. Benjamin Harrison was the first president to have electricity installed in the White House, but he and his wife were afraid to touch the light switches. There's a sublime irony in ushering modernity into the White House, only to be too terrified to use it. Benjamin Harrison, grandson of the speech-doomed William Henry Harrison, holds the distinction of being the first president to bring electricity into 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And yet, neither he nor his wife dared to flip the light switches. Installed in 1891, the new electrical system was state-of-the-art, meaning it was loud, temperamental, and terrifying. Sparks were common. Wires looked like tentacles snaking through the walls. The fear wasn't irrational. Early electricity had a nasty habit of electrocuting the curious. So the Harrisons did what any reasonably cautious Victorian couple would do. They left the switches alone and let the staff handle it. This wasn't just a personal quirk. It was emblematic of Harrison's entire presidency. He was progressive in policy, but stiff in presentation. He supported civil rights, advanced naval modernization, and pushed for federal education funding. Yet he lacked the charisma to sell it. He lit the house, but couldn't light up a room. Still, the symbolism of electrifying the White House was massive. It marked a transition, a literal switch, from gaslight to Edison's bold, buzzing promise. America was charging ahead, and Harrison, even with his caution, was part of the circuit. It's easy to laugh now, but there's something oddly relatable in Harrison's hesitation. Progress isn't just about installing new tech, it's about trusting it. And while he may have avoided zapping himself, he also missed the thrill of that first jolt. Now let's turn to another odd presidential ritual, one with a floral twist. William McKinley believed in luck, and he wore it on his lapel. Get ready for red carnations and presidential superstition. William McKinley wore a red carnation for good luck, which he often gave away to well-wishers. In the sea of somber portraits and stiff upper lips that populate the pantheon of U.S. presidents, William McKinley had a soft spot for a delicate symbol of luck, the red carnation. Always pinned to his lapel, always present during speeches, meetings, and photo ops, it was more than a fashion choice. It was a charm, a ritual, a superstition wrapped in petals. And McKinley, precise and reserved, took it seriously. The carnation became his signature. He wore it religiously, and more charmingly gave it away to admirers, especially children. If someone complimented it, he'd pluck it off and hand it over with a smile. That tiny gesture, floral, fleeting, somehow humanized a man better known for high tariffs and a war with Spain. It made him approachable, almost tender. But here's where the story turns tragic. On September 6, 1901, at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, McKinley was greeting visitors when a young girl asked for his flower. True to form, he smiled, removed it from his lapel, and gave it to her. Minutes later, an anarchist named Leon Czolgosz stepped forward in line and shot him twice in the abdomen. He died days later. And just like that, the flower stopped blooming. The red carnation, once a symbol of optimism, was forever tainted with irony. The thing he gave away to connect, to bring luck, vanished the moment he might have needed it most. History rarely lets a symbol rest. It turns every detail into foreshadowing. And in McKinley's case, that little flower was both signature and curse. Speaking of duality, our next president was a hunter and a conservationist, a man who shot animals in the morning and saved them by policy in the afternoon. Let's enter the wilderness of Theodore Roosevelt's moral contradictions. Theodore Roosevelt helped found the Boone and Crockett Club for wildlife conservation. Theodore Roosevelt shot things, a lot of things. He hunted lions in Africa, bears in the Rockies, and probably scared pigeons just by shouting at them. But beneath the blood-splattered bravado was something deeper, a reverence for nature's complexity. TR wasn't just a big game enthusiast. He was also one of America's earliest and most aggressive conservationists. And in 1887, he co-founded the Boone and Crockett Club to make sure there'd still be wild places left for all that shooting. Or better yet, for no shooting at all. It sounds contradictory, and it is. But Roosevelt thrived in contradiction. He believed that to protect something, you first had to understand its value. He didn't romanticize nature. He respected its brutality. He wanted to preserve vast landscapes not because they were pretty postcards, but because they were crucibles of character. The Boone and Crockett Club brought together elite sportsmen, scientists, and lawmakers who shared this double-edged creed that responsible hunting and serious conservation could coexist. They lobbied for protected lands, ethical hunting standards, and wildlife management long before it became trendy. Roosevelt himself used the presidency like a national park bulldozer, creating 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, and 150 national forests. He protected over 230 million acres of public land. And yet, he still posed with trophies, still boasted of kills, still told stories of charging grizzlies with manic glee. TR's conservationism wasn't passive. It was active, sometimes violent, always complex. From rugged trails to manicured fairways, we now slide toward another presidential pastime. This one less lethal, but no less obsessive. William Howard Taft didn't wrestle grizzlies. He battled sand traps. Let's tee off with the man who took presidential golf carts to the next level. William Howard Taft enjoyed playing golf so much that he had a special golf cart built for him. William Howard Taft didn't move quickly, physically at least. At over 300 pounds, he was a gravitational force unto himself, and every step looked like a negotiation with the ground. So when he fell in love with golf, a sport that demands walking miles under the pretense of leisure, he improvised. Thus was born one of the earliest presidential golf carts, a custom-built contraption to help him cruise the course without losing dignity or oxygen. The cart, if you can call it that, was more carriage than electric marvel. Think early 1900 essays engineering with a sprinkle of aristocratic absurdity. But it served a function. It let Taft play as often as he liked, without the inconvenience of motion. And he played a lot. By some estimates, he played over 400 rounds during his presidency, a staggering number for a man who was also supposed to be running a country. Taft's love of golf didn't win him many fans. At the time, golf was still considered elitist, un-American, even vaguely British. It didn't help that Taft wasn't exactly relatable. His golf obsession became symbolic of what critics saw as his presidency: aloof, privileged, slow-moving, and occasionally out of bounds. But in truth, golf was the only place where Taft found real joy. He wasn't a natural politician. He was a jurist, a thinker, a man who preferred deliberation to campaigning. On the green, no one shouted. No one filibustered. The rules were clear, the pace predictable, and no one expected him to smile for the cameras while doing it. So yes, Taft's golf cart might seem ridiculous, but it was also a rolling sanctuary. And speaking of oceans crossed and illusions shattered, our next fact finds us aboard a ship bound for diplomacy. Woodrow Wilson didn't just stay home. He sailed straight into the heart of Europe's post-war mess. Woodrow Wilson was the first president to cross the Atlantic Ocean while in office to attend the Paris Peace Conference. Woodrow Wilson, the academic turned president with a voice like parchment and a gaze of perpetual moral disappointment, did something no president before him had dared. He left the country while still in office. In 1918, at the end of World War I, Wilson boarded the USS George Washington and crossed the Atlantic Ocean to attend the Paris Peace Conference. It wasn't a vacation. It was a mission, a pilgrimage, a personal crusade to shape the world order with something dangerously close to idealism. This was more than travel. It was transformation. Wilson believed he could bring reason to chaos, structure to vengeance, and above all, his beloved League of Nations to life. He arrived in Paris like a philosophical prophet, 14 points in his briefcase and a naive belief that war could end all wars. The symbolism was immense. A sitting U.S. president on foreign soil, negotiating with kings, prime ministers, and emperors. For a nation that had long avoided entangling alliances, Wilson's voyage marked a break in tradition. He wasn't just participating in world politics. He was trying to rewrite them. But it didn't work. The Europeans wanted reparations, revenge, and red lines. Wilson wanted principles and peace. He got neither. The League of Nations was born, yes, but without the U.S. because Congress shot it down like a hawk spotting a dove. His return home was bitter, defiant, and soon followed by a stroke that left him incapacitated. He sailed across the world for a dream and came back to silence. Now, from international voyages to domestic gimmicks, let's swing wildly back into the absurd. Because our next president didn't campaign with just slogans or speeches. He brought a literal mascot. Warren G. Harding had an elephant named Laddie Boy. And no, this is not a metaphor. Warren G. Harding had an elephant named Laddie Boy as a campaign mascot. Warren G. Harding didn't exactly scream innovation. His presidency is usually remembered for scandals, card games, and whispered rumors of affairs. But when it came to public relations, Harding was ahead of his time. Enter Laddie Boy, an Airedale Terrier who lived like a dignitary and campaigned like a sideshow. But before the White House dog became famous, Harding briefly experimented with something even more preposterous, an elephant mascot. Laddie Boy, of course, stole the show later. But the idea of using a literal elephant, a living, breathing symbol of the Republican Party, as a campaign gimmick was peak Harding. It was as subtle as a marching band in a library. The elephant appeared in parades, posed for photos, and reminded voters that Harding wasn't just running for president. He was running as the embodiment of party tradition, with a trunk and tusks to prove it. The stunt worked. People loved it. The elephant helped soften Harding's image, which up until then consisted mainly of vacant handsomeness and a voice that could lull barns to sleep. The animal appeal, combined with his promise of a return to normalcy, painted Harding as a friendly, familiar choice. Never mind the scandals lurking just over the horizon. And once elected, he doubled down on the animal diplomacy. Laddie Boy became a national celebrity, complete with photo ops, press coverage, and his own ceremonial chair during cabinet meetings. The line between politics and performance blurred into absurdity. Speaking of absurd, our next president didn't just ride out economic collapse and speak with a dry monotone. He held press briefings while riding a motorized hobby horse. Yes, Calvin Coolidge. Silent Cal on an electric toy. Buckle up. It gets weirder. Calvin Coolidge often held press conferences with reporters while riding an electric horse. Calvin Coolidge was known for saying as little as humanly possible, unless it was to answer questions from the saddle of a mechanical steed. Yes, the president nicknamed Silent Cal once held briefings for the White House press corps, while astride an electric horse in his office. And not as a joke, not as satire, but as part of a daily routine he took with deadly puritanical seriousness. The electric horse was designed for health, of course. A kind of 1920s exercise machine intended to mimic the movements of riding, without the inconvenience of actual horses. Coolidge believed it improved his circulation and posture. So he'd straddle this wheezing contraption, dressed in full presidential dignity, and speak in his signature monotone while his body rocked gently back and forth. Reporters didn't know what to do with it. Imagine trying to transcribe a quote about tariffs while the president bobs in and out of your line of sight like a haunted grandfather clock. Some thought it was brilliant, an embodiment of Coolidge's dry, droll style. Others thought it was deeply, irreparably weird. Coolidge didn't care. He hated wasted time. The electric horse allowed him to combine briefings with cardio. Efficiency was his love language. It's poetic, really. The president, who said almost nothing, managed to turn even his silence into a kind of performance art. Mechanized, rhythmic, and unsettling. Now, from one strange machine to another, let's follow a future orphan, engineer, and fish whisperer who would one day inherit a collapsing economy. Herbert Hoover's next, and he's bringing a resume that includes both Stanford and starvation survival. Herbert Hoover was an orphan and paid his way through Stanford University. Long before he was branded as the face of economic despair, Herbert Hoover was a living testament to bootstrap mythology. Orphaned by the age of 9, father dead of a heart attack, mother gone from pneumonia, Hoover was shuffled between relatives in Oregon, growing up in a Quaker household that prized silence, humility, and hard work. It wasn't a nurturing childhood. It was a quiet, dusty struggle. But Hoover didn't just survive. He engineered his way out. Literally. In 1891, he joined Stanford University's very first freshman class, not because of legacy or wealth, but because it was one of the few institutions offering a real shot at higher education for someone without connections, and because Stanford was free. Even then, he couldn't afford room and board without working. So he took odd jobs: laundry, delivery boy, typist, student assistant. At one point, he worked as a geology assistant, carrying heavy equipment through remote mountain ranges. His degree was in geology, but what he majored in was self-reliance. He didn't just earn grades, he earned everything. And after graduating, he went on to become a globe-trotting mining engineer, amassing wealth and respect long before politics ever came calling. And yet, when the Great Depression hit, that same self-reliance turned against him. Hoover believed in individual initiative, in the idea that people could pull themselves up as he had. What he missed, fatally, was that most people weren't starting with the same tools. Still, the orphan who built himself a career from nothing remains one of the most underestimated intellects in presidential history. Now, let's turn from industrial rigor to philatelic obsession. Because our next president wasn't just fighting fascists, he was collecting stamps like a kid with a flashlight under the covers. Franklin D. Roosevelt is back, this time with ink on his fingers. Franklin D. Roosevelt coined the phrase, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." In the depths of the Great Depression, with banks collapsing and breadlines stretching across city blocks, Franklin D. Roosevelt stepped to the microphone on Inauguration Day, 1933, and delivered what would become one of the most iconic lines in American political history. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. It wasn't just a slogan. It was a full-on psychological intervention, administered over radio waves to a country curled up in economic fetal position. FDR didn't coin the line entirely on his own. His speechwriter helped shape it. But he made it immortal. It struck at something primal, the paralysis of uncertainty. Roosevelt understood that fear, left unchecked, feeds on itself, stalling progress, eroding trust, turning society into a series of nervous breakdowns in hats and overcoats. But the real brilliance wasn't just rhetorical. It was strategic. By naming fear, he tamed it. He made Americans believe that they weren't helpless victims of a broken system, but participants in a psychological war that could be won through courage and collective resolve. It was therapy by fireside chat, and it worked. He followed up those words with action. Bank holidays, the New Deal, job programs, reforms. Roosevelt was selling more than optimism. He was selling motion, forward motion, even if it came through alphabet soup agencies and chaotic experimentation. And beneath it all, he continued collecting stamps, carefully arranging them like metaphors for a fractured world trying to hold itself together one postmark at a time. Next, we descend from rhetorical high ground to something far more casual: cards, chips, and a poker face that could bluff a general. Harry S. Truman is up, and he's bringing the White House poker table back into play. Again. This time with more stakes. Harry S. Truman enjoyed playing cards and often hosted poker games at the White House. Harry S. Truman was a man of brutal clarity. He dropped the atomic bomb, fired General MacArthur, and walked through the front door of the presidency like someone clocking in for work. But behind the blunt exterior and wire-rimmed glasses was a guy who loved cards, poker in particular. Not just occasionally, but obsessively. And not just for fun, but as a way of life. He hosted regular poker nights in the White House, turning the most powerful residence in the world into a smoke-filled room of strategy, bluffing, and laughter. Aides, advisors, friends, even visiting dignitaries were welcome, if they could handle the stakes and didn't mind Truman's delight in a solid hand. He played five-card stud like he governed. Direct, no nonsense, high risk. To Truman, poker wasn't just a game. It was a proving ground. You learned who you could trust, who could hold their nerves, who understood timing, patience, and guts. And Truman had all of that in spades, and hearts, and clubs. He once said poker taught him more about human nature than politics ever could. He kept a poker table aboard the presidential train, too. Because nothing says leader of the free world like a whiskey in one hand and a royal flush in the other, while America barrels across the Midwest. Of course, critics called it unserious. But Truman didn't care. For a man who made some of the heaviest decisions in history, cards offered a strange kind of clarity. Rules, probabilities, consequences. Unlike politics, poker didn't lie. And now, speaking of unpredictable behavior and wild cards, let's move on to a man who turned the White House into his own personal zoo. Lyndon B. Johnson didn't just govern hard. He gifted electric toothbrushes and brought an armadillo named Big Tex along for the ride. Again. Dwight D. Eisenhower was a talented cook, particularly known for his beef stew. Before he was Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces in Europe, or the 34th President of the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower was a man who liked to stand over a pot of boiling meat and get the seasoning just right. Not because he had to, not for the cameras, but because he genuinely loved to cook, especially beef stew, which became something of a signature dish, equal parts hearty and unpretentious, just like the man himself. He wasn't faking it either. Ike took his culinary hobby seriously. He'd chop onions, trim fat, and obsess over spice levels like a military strategist calculating troop movements. He didn't just slap ingredients into a pot. He wrote recipes, detailed ones, with instructions, timing, and even notes on texture. Some of these recipes ended up in White House archives, written in his own careful handwriting. This wasn't just a wartime general's hobby. It was a ritual. Cooking gave Ike control. It gave him peace. After commanding vast armies and enduring years of political maneuvering, the kitchen was a space where the only enemy was undercooked potatoes. Guests at the White House would sometimes find him hovering near the stove, ladle in hand, eyebrows furrowed in concentration. Staff would try to shoo him out. He was the president, after all, but he insisted. This wasn't about protocol, it was about stew. And in a way, it made sense. Eisenhower's entire philosophy of leadership was built on balance, on methodical action, on simmering things slowly until they came together. His beef stew was, in a way, an edible metaphor for his presidency. Simple, grounded, and quietly effective. From one domestic indulgence to another, we now swing to a man whose legacy burned bright and ended fast, John F. Kennedy, whose words echoed through the Cold War, starting with a challenge. Ask not what your country can do for you. John F. Kennedy famously said, "Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country." There are sound bites, and then there are seismic shifts disguised as sound bites. John F. Kennedy's inaugural address in 1961 wasn't just eloquent. It was a rebranding of American identity. In one clean, clipped sentence, Kennedy managed to pivot the national psyche from consumption to contribution. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. It was moral jujitsu, patriotic poetry, and political hypnosis all at once. Kennedy, the youngest elected president, walked into office with the energy of a man trying to sprint through a minefield. The Cold War was in full freeze. Civil rights tensions were simmering, and nuclear weapons loomed over breakfast tables. But there he was, cool as ice, turning obligation into a call to greatness. The line wasn't just a request, it was a dare, and people believed it. They signed up for the Peace Corps, they volunteered. They stopped seeing government as a vending machine and started seeing it, at least for a while, as a common project. That one sentence ignited idealism in a generation who thought the future could be built, not inherited. Of course, the myth of Camelot outlasted its king. Kennedy's presidency was cut short by an assassin's bullet, and his soaring rhetoric remains preserved in amber. Glorious, tragic, unfinished. But those 22 words still ring in every political speech that tries to sound bigger than itself. From eloquent idealism, we leap to grand Texan excess. Lyndon B. Johnson didn't speak in slogans. He shouted in barbecue sauce. He gave out gifts like Santa on caffeine and held meetings in places most men keep private. LBJ is next, and he's not arriving quietly. Lyndon B. Johnson was known for giving elaborate gifts, including electric toothbrushes and barbecue equipment. Lyndon Baines Johnson gave gifts the way other people give handshakes, with force, frequency, and questionable boundaries. He didn't just hand out White House pens or commemorative coins. No, LBJ gave electric toothbrushes. He gave full barbecue sets. He once handed out monogrammed robes like he was running a strange hotel for senators. Why? Because Johnson understood power in its most tactile form. Gifts were leverage, relationship currency. And an electric toothbrush wasn't just dental hygiene. It was a reminder that the President of the United States knew your molar situation and cared enough to upgrade it. This was classic LBJ. Overwhelming, personal, invasive. He didn't just want to be liked, he wanted to be unforgettable. Guests would leave meetings with bags of swag and mental whiplash. Even foreign dignitaries got a taste of Johnson's Southern hospitality, often in the form of cowboy hats, smoked meats, and deeply awkward photo ops. And it wasn't just gifting. LBJ had a way of operating that blurred personal space and protocol. He'd conduct meetings in his pajamas, call people into the bathroom while he was using it, and dictate policy from a floating lounge chair in the pool. He believed politics was intimacy, raw, relentless, and occasionally very damp. But behind the kitsch was strategic genius. Johnson was a master legislator. He rammed through the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the Great Society programs, transforming the country even as his methods made colleagues squirm. And now, from one eccentric performer to another, though our next entry swapped policies for piano keys. Richard Nixon may be remembered for Watergate, but before the fall came something strangely elegant. A president playing classical piano. No lies, no cover-ups, just fingers on the keys. Almost. Richard Nixon was an accomplished classical pianist. Before he was Tricky Dick, before the tapes and the cover-ups, Richard Nixon was a boy in Yorba Linda, California, hunched over a piano. His fingers, later known for signing resignations and gesturing defensively during press conferences, once danced delicately across ivory keys. Nixon wasn't just a hobbyist. He was good, formally trained, competent enough to compose music, perform in public, and even play on national television. Not that you'd expect it. Nixon's public persona was stiff, awkward, a little bit haunted. But at the piano, something strange happened. He softened. There's footage, grainy, surreal, of Nixon playing on The Tonight Show, plinking out his own compositions while Johnny Carson watches, eyebrows raised somewhere near disbelief. The music isn't spectacular, but it's real, earnest. It's Nixon trying to connect in the most un-Nixon way possible, through vulnerability. It's one of the few public acts where he wasn't deflecting or attacking. No talking points, just music. And for a man so notoriously guarded, it's almost jarring. It's also telling. Nixon didn't just play piano, he hid inside it. He composed campaign songs and lullabies. He wrote music during the loneliest parts of his presidency, when Watergate turned the West Wing into a pressure cooker. Somewhere between the lies and lawsuits, a former Quaker boy was still writing melodies to no one. From one unlikely talent to another, we slide into the snow-covered slopes of Gerald Ford's strange presidency. Because while Nixon was playing piano, Ford was skiing downhill, both literally and metaphorically. Gerald Ford was a model in his youth and appeared on the cover of Look magazine. Gerald Ford was America's most accidental president. He wasn't elected to the presidency or vice presidency. But long before the constitutional fluke that vaulted him into office, he did something almost no other commander-in-chief ever managed. He made it into the pages of a fashion magazine. Yes, Gerald R. Ford, the supposedly clumsy placeholder president, was once a clean-cut, square-jawed model. In the 1940s, fresh out of the Navy and studying law at Yale, Ford paid the bills by modeling for Look magazine, often alongside his then-girlfriend and future wife, Betty. There are photos, glorious, painfully earnest, of Ford posing in preppy sweaters, crisp button-downs, and wholesome smiles so wide they practically salute the flag. It's deeply ironic considering how history remembers him. Ford is the butt of endless pratfall jokes, thanks to a few stumbles caught on camera and a Saturday Night Live caricature that stuck harder than any actual policy achievement. But in his youth, he looked like he walked off the set of a 1950s detergent commercial. Tall, blonde, and built like a linebacker. Because, well, he was one. His modeling wasn't vanity. It was necessity. Ford was pragmatic, an athlete, a lawyer, and a man who did what needed doing. It's just that once, what needed doing was selling suits in a post-war men's fashion spread. And now, from modeling to peanuts. From Ford's polished jawlines, we move to the quiet soul who swapped the White House for a peanut farm and submarine duty. Jimmy Carter's next, and his resume reads like a Southern fable wrapped in nuclear codes. Jimmy Carter worked as a peanut farmer and served in the Navy's nuclear submarine program. Jimmy Carter's life is what happens when a folk ballad collides with a classified defense manual. Born in Plains, Georgia, Carter grew up in a town with more fields than people. After his father's death, he returned home to run the family's peanut farm. A dusty, humbling job that required boots, patience, and a bone-deep understanding of weather. But Carter wasn't just a farmer. He was a man of contrasts, a rural intellectual, a Baptist engineer, a workhorse with a Nobel Prize hiding in his back pocket. Before taking up peanuts, Carter served in the Navy, joining Admiral Hyman Rickover's elite nuclear submarine program. It wasn't just hard, it was brutal. Rickover was infamous for grilling candidates like they were on trial for treason. Carter passed. Barely. But the experience forged him. It drilled into him a reverence for discipline, systems, and silent endurance. This duality defined his political life. As president, Carter was moral, but misread. Practical, but politically tone-deaf. He wore sweaters instead of suits during energy crises. He gave speeches about malaise without ever saying the word. He brokered peace in the Middle East, but couldn't free hostages in Iran. People mocked him for being just a peanut farmer. They didn't understand that Carter's strength was precisely in that humility. He wasn't trying to be king. He was trying to be caretaker. And now, from moral earnestness to showbiz polish, Ronald Reagan enters stage right, script memorized, lens flare ready. The oldest man ever elected in his first term, and one of the smoothest operators to ever read from the teleprompter. Ronald Reagan was the oldest president elected to his first term, 69 years old, when Ronald Reagan took the oath of office in 1981. He did so as a 69-year-old man with perfect hair, a cowboy's drawl, and a memory like a Hollywood script, edited, selective, but compelling. At the time, he was the oldest person ever elected to the presidency, and many Americans, including his own advisors, quietly wondered if the country had just handed nuclear codes to their grandfather. And yet, Reagan didn't slow down. If anything, he accelerated. Riding horses at Camp David, cracking jokes at summits, and spinning Cold War threats into bedtime stories for the American public. "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," he would later declare, like a sheriff ordering down a bandit. But that age hung in the air like stage fog. Was he too old to lead? Was he out of touch? Reagan countered with what he always used best: charm. During a debate with Walter Mondale, he famously quipped, "I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit, for political purposes, my opponent's youth and inexperience." Even Mondale had to laugh. And just like that, age stopped being a liability. It became part of the legend. Behind the scenes, however, time was ticking. Reagan's second term saw the quiet creep of memory lapses and confusion, long before his Alzheimer's diagnosis became public. But in his first term, he was clear-eyed, focused, and shockingly effective. Tax reforms, deregulation, Star Wars, the missile program, not the movie. Whether you admired or despised him, Reagan's first term was not the presidency of a doddering retiree. It was the final act of a seasoned performer who knew exactly how to play his audience. Speaking of hobbies that border on the obsessive, let's turn now to George H.W. Bush, who traded war zones for fishing zones, diplomacy for casting lines, and managed to hook his own legacy in the process. George H.W. Bush was a passionate fisherman. For George Herbert Walker Bush, fishing wasn't just a hobby, it was a religion with hooks. Amidst a life defined by war diplomacy and occasionally falling off stages, Bush Sr. found his most genuine moments with a rod in hand and silence in the air. He didn't just like fishing, he lived it. He fished in Maine, in Florida, in the Gulf, and anywhere else a quiet cove could replace a policy briefing. The man had fought in World War II, jumped out of planes, headed the CIA, and steered the country through the end of the Cold War. But ask him about détente, and you'd get a paragraph. Ask him about striped bass, and you'd get an hour. Even his presidential schedule, normally packed with meetings, briefings, and handshakes, would bend for a good fishing window. He was known to bring foreign leaders to his home in Kennebunkport, Maine, not just to talk shop, but to drop lines. In those moments, diplomacy smelled like seaweed and sounded like laughter. There were no cameras, no scripts, just fish stories and sunscreen. Fishing was Bush's way of recharging, of escaping the noise without abandoning reflection. His speeches were laced with water metaphors. His memoirs mentioned tides more than taxes. He believed in calm, in patience, in waiting for the right tug. And after the presidency, he didn't write novels or give lucrative speeches. He just kept fishing. His Secret Service detail reportedly carried tackle gear. His grandkids learned casting before politics. And when he passed, Kennebunkport's harbor held a silent tribute. One more cast for the quiet statesman. But the quiet ends here. Our next subject is louder, brassy, and knows his way around a saxophone. Bill Clinton didn't just charm rooms. He played them like jazz. Let's cue the music. Bill Clinton is known for his skill with the saxophone. If charisma were a sound, Bill Clinton made it hum in B-flat. From his campaign trail strolls to his late-night talk show appearances, Clinton didn't just enter rooms, he filled them. And sometimes he did it with a saxophone in hand. His infamous performance on the Arsenio Hall show in 1992 wasn't a side note in the campaign. It was a trumpet blast announcing that politics had entered its MTV era. Clinton, shades on, sax out, didn't just play music, he played perception. At a time when the country was emerging from a string of colder, more stoic administrations, here was a guy who could jam with the band and then talk economics without missing a beat. He wasn't just relatable, he was cool in that dad at a jazz club kind of way. And voters took notice. The saxophone was a symbol, a rebellion against stiffness, a coded message that said, "I'm not like the others." And for many, that was enough. Clinton rode that vibe straight into the White House. He kept playing, too. Not often, and never during budget negotiations, but enough to keep the legend alive. His musicianship wasn't just a party trick, it was part of the brand. He could quote policy and Coltrane, balance budgets and blues scales. Of course, like most things Clintonian, The charm masked complexity. The man who could improvise on stage also improvised in the press room. His presidency was a constant tension between brilliance and scandal, sax solos and subpoenas. But for one moment, one unforgettable TV appearance, Clinton made politics swing. And that sound still echoes. Next up, another president with sports in his blood, literally. George W. Bush didn't just govern like a team owner, he was one. Let's grab our gloves and head for the dugout. George W. Bush was a co-owner of the Texas Rangers baseball team. Before he was the 43rd president of the United States, George W. Bush was an enthusiastic, occasionally awkward, but undeniably charismatic co-owner of the Texas Rangers baseball team. And for a brief window in the early 1990s, he was more ballpark than beltway, more seventh-inning stretch than Senate committee. His presidency may be remembered for 9/11's Iraq and a certain stubborn smirk. But long before that, Bush Jr. was in the dugout, cheering foul balls and shaking hands with ketchup-stained fans. He bought into the Rangers in 1989 with a group of investors. But unlike many silent partners, Bush was anything but quiet. He took on a public-facing role, attending games, mingling with players, and even helping to secure public funding for a new stadium, an act of negotiation that would foreshadow his comfort with bending civic sentiment toward private development. For Texas voters, this version of Bush, the baseball guy, the relatable everyman, the joke-cracking optimist, was far easier to swallow than the political legacy of his patrician father. The Texas Rangers gig gave Bush a platform, a persona, and most importantly, name recognition. His rise from the team's front office to the Texas governorship was no accident. It was a carefully pitched climb, engineered in part from the bleachers. He didn't just own part of a team, he owned the narrative. And even after becoming president, Bush carried the rhythm of baseball with him. His ceremonial first pitch at Yankee Stadium after 9/11 was both symbolic and chillingly perfect. A strike down the middle, bulletproof vest beneath his jacket, America's trauma wrapped in a single silent throw. From the diamond to the driving range, our next commander-in-chief kept his cool on the fairway. Left-handed clubs in hand, big dreams in his head. Let's swing into the low-key leisure of Barack Obama. Barack Obama is left-handed. It's a small detail, easily overlooked. But Barack Obama's left-handedness is more than a biological quirk. It's a metaphor, a symbol, a subtle defiance of the norm. In a world designed for right-handed people, Obama was constantly adapting, flipping the script. Whether it was signing bills, shaking hands, or steering the ship of state during a global recession. Only a handful of U.S. presidents have been left-handed, but they're an elite and curious club. Garfield, Truman, Ford, Reagan, sort of. Bush Sr., Clinton, and then Obama. Some say lefties are more creative, others more strategic. Obama, with his cerebral demeanor and jazz-like cadence, fit the mold perfectly. He was a thinker who spoke like a poet, governed like a professor, and handled his golf game with quiet frustration and a southpaw grip. In press photos, the left-hand dominance stands out, pen poised, wrist cocked in that signature arc as he signs executive orders or pens thoughtful letters. It adds to the image of Obama as slightly different, slightly cooler, slightly more ambidextrous in both thought and action than the usual political fare. And while he didn't make a spectacle of it, Obama's left-handedness became an almost aesthetic feature of his presidency. It helped round out his image. The first black president, the Harvard Law Review guy, the orator, the dad joke machine. And yes, the lefty. But now we pivot from golf swings and constitutional law to the neon-tinged spectacle of reality television. Because up next is a man who didn't need Air Force One to be famous. Donald Trump made his name in gold letters long before the Oval Office, and it all began with a boardroom and a catchphrase. Let's roll the tape. Donald Trump hosted the reality television show The Apprentice. Before the escalator, before the hats, before the chants and chaos and classified folders tucked behind bathroom doors, Donald J. Trump was simply America's most theatrical boss. His platform wasn't a campaign, it was prime-time television. The Apprentice, launched in 2004, didn't just revive Trump's persona. It created an empire of perception. For 14 seasons, millions watched him sit in an over-decorated boardroom, furrow his brow, and deliver the catchphrase that became cultural currency. "You're fired." The show was part business simulation, part soap opera, part propaganda reel. It painted Trump not as a real estate inheritor with bankruptcies, but as a decisive titan of industry who could spot talent, reward hustle, and ruthlessly eliminate the weak. It was myth-making at its slickest, and America ate it up. And Trump played the role with gusto. He wasn't acting. He was curating an image. The strong man in a suit, the billionaire with no time for incompetence, the alpha male who knew what was best. It didn't matter if the deals were fake, the boardroom was staged, or the timelines compressed. What mattered was the illusion, and it stuck. The Apprentice gave Trump something more potent than cash. It gave him familiarity, recognition. It made him a household brand in living rooms that would later vote for him. And when he finally descended that golden escalator in 2015, declaring his candidacy, it felt, bizarrely, like a season premiere. From the reality show host to the mythic founding father, we now time warp backward to the first of them all, George Washington, the man with the wooden teeth, or so the legend goes. But the truth? Even weirder. Let's bite into it. George Washington wore dentures made of ivory, lead, and human teeth, not wood. George Washington's mouth was a battlefield, and not just because of what came out of it. The man who couldn't tell a lie, allegedly, could barely chew a carrot by the end of his life. Washington's dental problems were legendary. He started losing teeth in his 20s and ended up with a grand total of one lone survivor by the time he was sworn in as president. That's right. The father of the country had only one original tooth left in his mouth when he took office. The dentures? Far more grotesque than school textbooks would have you believe. They weren't made of wood. That's a myth propagated by bad illustrations and worse oral history. The real dentures were cobbled together from ivory, usually from hippos or elephants, brass, lead, gold wire, and yes, actual human teeth. Some purchased from enslaved people, a dark irony for a man remembered as a symbol of liberty. They didn't fit well. They made his face look sunken and distorted. He rarely smiled. His speeches, though iconic, were often delivered through clenched discomfort. He had to adjust the dentures constantly, using facial muscles more suited to war than dining. And yet, through all that dental misery, Washington became the template for every president to follow. Rigid dignity, carefully restrained emotions, and a constant battle between private suffering and public myth. From the mythic to the mundane, we moved to a man who followed Washington's act by walking into an unfinished White House with a quill in one hand and bitter sarcasm in the other. John Adams didn't just live in the White House first. He made it a home built on letters, loneliness, and political exasperation. John Adams was the first president to live in the White House, though it was still under construction. When John Adams finally arrived at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue in November 1800, he wasn't greeted by grandeur or completed corridors. The White House, then just the President's house, was still very much a work in progress. Fireplaces smoked badly. The walls were damp. The floors unfinished. The roof leaked. There was no plumbing, no insulation, and the entire East Room was little more than a cold, echoing chamber of dust and scaffolding. But Adams, in his usual grim resolve, moved in anyway. He was nearing the end of his term, having lost re-election to Jefferson, and in many ways, the unfinished house mirrored his own presidency. Misunderstood, underappreciated, but foundational. He called it home, albeit grudgingly, and even penned one of his most famous letters from its chilly halls, a note to his wife Abigail in which he prayed that future presidents would be as honest and dedicated to the country's good as he tried to be. There's something beautifully tragic in that image. the second president of the United States, huddled in a drafty, half-built mansion, writing letters by candlelight and waiting for history to catch up. Adams didn't just live in the White House. He haunted it, leaving behind a spectral sense of duty and bitter independence that every successor would either embrace or reject. And though Jefferson would take over and redesign much of the building's interior, it was Adams who first opened its door. From these construction site beginnings, we pivot to a man who didn't just decorate his home. He designed the furniture himself. Thomas Jefferson, polymath and paradox, is next. And he's about to invent the one thing we all swivel in today, the rotating chair. Thomas Jefferson was an accomplished architect and designed Monticello. Thomas Jefferson wasn't just the author of the Declaration of Independence. He was a design-obsessed Renaissance man with blueprints for everything from domed rotundas to rotating bookshelves. His home, Monticello, stands not merely as a residence but as a physical extension of his mind. Orderly, enlightenment-soaked, and maddeningly contradictory, Monticello wasn't built for comfort. It was built to express. It whispered in neoclassical, spoke in symmetry, and shouted in hidden dumbwaiters and folding doors. Jefferson tinkered with it obsessively for decades, revising layouts, importing gadgets, and personally overseeing every angle of architecture as if each room were a stanza in a philosophical poem. He also invented, or at least significantly refined, the swivel chair. Yes, the very thing you're probably sitting in right now. Jefferson supposedly wrote much of the Declaration from that rotating throne of practical genius, legs crossed, eyes narrowed, spinning from liberty to logic. He took Enlightenment ideas and literally turned them around in his seat. But like everything Jefferson touched, Monticello is stained with contradiction. It was a temple to freedom, built by enslaved hands, a house of ideals supported by human bondage. Jefferson, the thinker of liberty, lived on land maintained by the very institution he claimed to despise. His designs, both architectural and ideological, remain mesmerizing and maddening. They elevate and indict. Monticello is both museum and mausoleum, a home that reflects a mind always reaching for utopia, but never escaping its own era. And now, from the architectural philosopher to the diminutive statesman who followed him, James Madison. Frail in frame, immense in impact, and the last man standing from the convention that birthed a constitution. Let's step into his shadow. James Madison was a small and frail man who often suffered from illness. When you picture a founding father, you probably don't imagine someone standing barely over 5 feet tall and weighing less than 100 pounds soaking wet. But James Madison, the father of the Constitution, the architect of the Bill of Rights, and the fourth president of the United States, was physically unassuming to the point of vanishing. He looked like a man perpetually recovering from something, and most of the time he was. Madison suffered from a long list of illnesses, many of them vague by modern standards: seizures, anxiety attacks, psychosomatic breakdowns. In an era without antibiotics or a working definition of mental health, Madison lived with what seemed like a rotating wheel of physical fragility. His friends worried about him constantly. His political enemies mocked him. And yet, despite being a medical mystery in breeches, Madison outlived nearly all of them. There's a poetic contrast in the fact that such a physically delicate man carried the intellectual weight of an entire nation's legal foundation. He was the smallest man in every room and the most dangerous mind in it. He didn't shout, he didn't brawl, he wrote, he calculated. He strategized from the shadows. In the smoky halls of the Constitutional Convention, Madison wasn't just taking notes, he was writing the playbook. And when he finally ascended to the presidency, it was with the posture of someone who knew how empires fall, quietly, from within. Madison's health may have been weak, but his grasp of power was steely. He was proof that you don't need biceps to bend history. Now, from the frail constitutionalists to the last of the founding fathers, to sit in the Oval Office, James Monroe, a man who bled for the Revolution and signed compromise into law. Let's step into a presidency where expansion met quiet fracture. James Monroe was wounded during the Battle of Trenton in the Revolutionary War. Before he was a president with a doctrine and a perfectly combed mop of presidential hair, James Monroe was just another cold, bleeding soldier in the American Revolution. During the Battle of Trenton in 1776, a surprise attack led by George Washington across the icy Delaware, Monroe took a musket ball to the shoulder. He nearly died. An artery was severed. He would have bled out in the snow if not for the quick thinking of an army medic who tied off the wound with what little cloth he had. That's the kind of man Monroe was. Not a theorist, but a survivor. His legacy may be overshadowed by flashier founders, but Monroe's life was built on hard-earned resilience. He fought in major battles, suffered frostbite, and stood toe-to-toe with British soldiers long before he ever signed a treaty. That shoulder wound would haunt him for the rest of his life, a painful reminder of the price paid for a fledgling idea called America. Monroe's presidency would later be defined by territorial expansion and foreign policy, the Louisiana Purchase, the Missouri Compromise, the Monroe Doctrine. But that doctrine, which declared the Western Hemisphere off-limits to European meddling, wasn't just diplomacy. It was an extension of battlefield pragmatism. Monroe understood that peace is something you defend, sometimes with ink, sometimes with blood. His body carried the literal scars of revolution, and his governance reflected it. Quiet, principled, occasionally brutal in calculation. And now onto a man who stripped off more than just political pretense, John Quincy Adams, who took daily nude swims in the Potomac River. Yes, that's real. Yes, we're going there. Let's dive in. Literally. John Quincy Adams was a skilled diplomat and served as a U.S. Senator before becoming president. John Quincy Adams wasn't just the son of a president. He was the diplomatic equivalent of a Swiss Army knife wrapped in powdered Whig etiquette. By the time he reached the Oval Office, he had already served more governments than most politicians dare to dream of. Fluent in multiple languages, educated in Europe, and allergic to small talk, Adams was less a man and more a resume in human form. He served as a U.S. minister to the Netherlands, then Prussia, then Russia, then Britain, and each time he spoke the local language, dissected the politics, and negotiated like someone born to navigate the back rooms of empires. While most Americans were still figuring out which fork to use, Adams was attending royal courts and drafting treaties with ink-dipped precision. And before he stepped into the presidency, he also served as a U.S. Senator. But Adams in the Senate was like a shark in a goldfish tank. Brilliant, biting, and profoundly impatient with mediocrity. He didn't suffer fools. He didn't even tolerate mediocrities. This made him admired, respected, and also widely disliked. He was principled to the point of paralysis and dignified to the point of dysfunction. By the time he became president, Adams had more foreign policy experience than the rest of the government combined. But it didn't help. He was a genius in diplomacy and a disaster in politics. He hated campaigning, loathed party machines, and believed the presidency should be about merit, not manipulation. The country disagreed. His presidency floundered, but his legacy endured. He would go on to serve in Congress after being president. One of the few who didn't just fade into retirement, but chose to fight on. Now, from the diplomat to the duelist, we charge toward a man who turned political rage into gunpowder poetry. Andrew Jackson didn't just survive assassination attempts, he invited them. Andrew Jackson adopted an orphan Native American boy. Andrew Jackson was many things. War hero, populist icon, duelist, executioner of policies and people alike. But in the middle of this hardened persona, this thundercloud of contradictions, was a single soft, strange act. He adopted a Native American child, specifically a Creek orphan named Lincoya, found on a battlefield where Jackson's troops had slaughtered the boy's tribe. Jackson reportedly discovered the child clinging to his dead mother's body after the Battle of Tallushatchee in 1813. Moved, or perhaps compelled by some mixture of guilt and paternal instinct. He took the boy home to the Hermitage, his plantation in Tennessee. He raised Lincoln alongside his biological son, educated him, clothed him, and even expressed hope that he would grow into a role as a saddle maker. But Jackson refused to allow him into West Point, citing the political impossibility of a native cadet. It sounds noble until you zoom out. This is the same Andrew Jackson who would later sign the Indian Removal Act into law, setting in motion the Trail of Tears, a forced relocation that killed thousands of native people. It's as if he compartmentalized Lincoln as a personal exception, a human trophy that let him claim emotional complexity while engineering mass displacement. Lincoln died young, possibly of tuberculosis, possibly from the trauma of living in a paradox. He was buried at the Hermitage with a grave marker but little fanfare. This contradiction of care and cruelty runs like a fault line through Jackson's legacy. He could adopt a child of the people he displaced and still order their removal. The moral math doesn't work. But then again, Jackson never showed much interest in equations. And now, to a man remembered for coining phrases and facial hair, not policy. Martin Van Buren is next, and his name lives on every time you text OK. Kind of. Martin Van Buren was often called Old Kinderhook, which is thought to be the origin of the term OK. Martin Van Buren was not a thrilling president. He was a political tactician, a behind-the-curtain kind of guy, and his policies were largely forgettable unless you're really into banking panics. But what he lacked in drama, he may have made up for in linguistic immortality. Because Van Buren, hailing from Kinderhook, New York, was nicknamed Old Kinderhook. And from that, some believe, sprang one of the most globally recognized expressions in human language. Okay, as the story goes, Van Buren's supporters abbreviated Old Kinderhook to say OK for campaign purposes. The term caught on because it was catchy, novel, and easily repeatable, especially in newspapers trying to fill space. Some historians argue the term pre-existed in joking misspellings like "ol correct," but Van Buren's campaign certainly popularized it in a political context. In short, OK became a meme before memes were a thing. And while Van Buren's presidency ended with economic ruin and plummeting popularity, his nickname lived on, unbothered by his failures. Every time you type OK in a text, you're inadvertently nodding to a short sideburn Dutch American who liked backroom deals and running the Democratic Party like a chessboard. Beyond that linguistic legacy, Van Buren was the first president born after the country's independence and the first whose first language wasn't English, it was Dutch. He was American politics made flesh. Strategic, ambiguous, more about systems than stories. So while he wasn't a war hero or an orator, he may be the most accidentally influential man in your daily vocabulary. From subtle impact to shortest reign, we now turn to a president who caught a cold trying to prove he was tough and died faster than you can finish this sentence. William Henry Harrison is up, and he brought a coat too late. William Henry Harrison served the shortest term of any U.S. president, 31 days. William Henry Harrison's presidency was so short it makes a TikTok clip look like War and Peace. He delivered the longest inaugural speech in history, over 8,000 words in the cold, rain, without a hat or coat, and then promptly caught something awful and died. 31 days later, America had a new president. No scandals, no wars, no signature bills. Just pneumonia, poor judgment, and a warning about theatrical hubris. It's the kind of historical joke that writes itself. The oldest president elected at the time, trying to prove his youthful vigor, goes out and freezes his respiratory system in front of a live audience. All for the sake of appearing tough. It was political cosplay with fatal consequences. His campaign had been equally theatrical. Remember Tippecanoe and Tyler 2? That slogan, the log cabins, the hard cider imagery. It was the beginning of modern political marketing. Harrison was sold as a rugged frontiersman, even though he was born into Virginia aristocracy. Image over substance. Branding over biography. Sound familiar? And so, The man with the shortest presidency left a surprisingly long shadow. His death raised serious constitutional questions about presidential succession. Did the vice president become president or merely act as one? John Tyler settled it by just taking the job. No debate, no committee. He showed up and started acting presidential, daring anyone to stop him. They didn't. Thus began the tradition we still follow. If the president dies, the VP becomes the new head honcho. A legacy born from 31 days of stubborn oratory and one very bad decision about outerwear. Next up, the man who seized that sudden vacancy, John Tyler, a president with descendants still alive today and a marital age gap that turned heads then and now. John Tyler had 2 living grandsons from his first marriage as of 2024, making him the only president with such a direct and enduring lineage. Time does strange things to memory, but occasionally it lets us shake hands with the past in the most unsettling ways. John Tyler, the 10th President of the United States, born in 1790, when George Washington was still alive, has grandsons. Not great-great-great-grandchildren. Not some 6th cousin twice removed. Grandsons, living ones, breathing links between powdered wigs and power lines. How is this possible? Simple math meets improbable timing. Tyler fathered 15 children, yes, 15, and one of his sons, Lyon Gardner Tyler, decided late-in-life fatherhood was the way to go. Lyon had sons in the 1920s when he was already in his 70s. Those sons, Harrison and Lyon Jr., lived well into the 21st century. So as recently as 2024, you could talk to someone whose grandfather was born during the Washington administration. That's not just history. That's time travel without the DeLorean. It feels like a glitch in the Matrix. Like someone left the history simulator running too long. Tyler himself was controversial. He annexed Texas, was kicked out of his own party, and later joined the Confederate Congress. But all of that seems almost abstract compared to the raw weirdness of biological continuity. A man who rode horses to work has grandsons who grew up with color television. One fought to preserve Tyler's legacy. The other quietly lived on family land. Presidential history tends to flatten time. We forget that people like Tyler aren't just names in books. They have bloodlines. And sometimes those bloodlines live just long enough to whisper across centuries. From eerie genetics to iron mentorship, we now pivot to a president molded by Jacksonian fury. James K. Polk, the dark horse who worked like a demon and died young, is next in line. James K. Polk was a protege of Andrew Jackson. James K. Polk was Andrew Jackson's political Horcrux. A quieter, sharper, less violent echo of Old Hickory's will. Dubbed Young Hickory, Polk rose through the political ranks under Jackson's steely gaze, absorbing his mentor's populist instincts and ruthless efficiency. But sanding off the rougher edges. Polk didn't duel. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten bodily harm to Congress. He just worked. Constantly. Obsessively. Polk's career is a masterclass in Jacksonian legacy management. He inherited Jackson's enemies, adopted his causes, and carried the torch of manifest destiny like it was a personal vendetta. By the time he became president in 1845, Polk already had a Jackson-approved playbook. Expand west, crush opposition, and for God's sake, don't waste time. He made a list of 4 campaign promises and accomplished all of them in a single term. Lower tariffs, establish an independent treasury, settle the Oregon boundary, and acquire California. Then, like a self-erasing prophecy, he declined to run again. No farewell tour, no memoir, just deathbed exhaustion. Polk was a one-term whirlwind, a hyper-efficient force of nature who expanded the U.S. by over 1 million square miles. But he wasn't celebrated. He was too cold, too intense, too joyless. He didn't govern for love. He governed for the checklist. Historians argue over whether Polk was a genius or a Machiavellian opportunist. Either way, he got things done at a velocity that made others look lazy. He was the straight-A student of the Jacksonian school, rigid, grim, and terrifyingly productive. And next, we marched toward a man who looked more like a farmer than a general, dressed casually, and rarely cared for optics. Zachary Taylor, war hero, non-politician, and walking contradiction, is about to enter the frame. Zachary Taylor was known for his casual dress, often appearing in farmer's clothes. Zachary Taylor didn't believe in pomp. He didn't believe in fashion. He didn't even really believe in politicians, which made it all the more ironic that he became one. A career military man with little political experience and even less patience for bureaucracy, Taylor was known for showing up to formal events dressed like he was about to muck out a stable. When he wasn't in uniform, he preferred baggy trousers, muddy boots, and loose, dusty shirts that looked like they'd been retrieved from a cannon barrel. At his own inauguration, he supposedly opted for a black suit so ill-fitting it looked like borrowed clothes. He didn't dress for power, he dressed for comfort, or possibly spite. This aesthetic wasn't just laziness. It was brand strategy, even if Taylor never would have used that phrase. He wanted to project simplicity, authenticity, unpretentiousness. He was the "I'm not like those other guys" candidate decades before that became cliché, and Americans ate it up. The Mexican-American War had made him a national hero. His war-worn image sealed the deal. But governing, that was harder. Taylor struggled with the intricacies of politics, particularly the fiery debates over slavery and statehood. He tried to rise above partisanship, another irony, since his own political instincts were deeply unpolished. Still, people trusted him. He looked like someone who'd feed your dog and then win a war before lunch. And in a fractured, nervous nation, that counted for something. Yet, Taylor's presidency was cut short. Just 16 months in, he died unexpectedly, possibly from illness. Possibly from something more sinister. His sudden end only deepened the mystery of a man who seemed allergic to power, even while holding it. Next, another man with no political background and a taste for compromise. Millard Fillmore. The name may sound bland, but what he signed into law left deep scars. Millard Fillmore signed the Compromise of 1850. If there's a single word that encapsulates Millard Fillmore's presidency, it's compromise, though not the inspiring kind. More like the backroom deal duct tape over a bullet hole kind. Fillmore, a man who once taught himself to read by candlelight and clawed his way up from poverty, ended up wielding the pen that signed one of the most controversial pieces of legislation in antebellum America. The Compromise of 1850. This package of laws was supposed to cool tensions between the North and South over slavery. Instead, it acted like a political sedative, masking the symptoms while the disease festered. It admitted California as a free state and abolished the slave trade in Washington, D.C., which sounded great, until you got to the Fugitive Slave Act, a provision so draconian it effectively deputized ordinary citizens into the slave-catching business. It made northern states complicit in enforcing slavery, igniting outrage among abolitionists and further polarizing the country. Fillmore defended the compromise as the necessary middle path. He fancied himself a stabilizer, a moderate who could hold the Union together by sheer procedural stamina. But in practice, his attempts to appease both sides satisfied neither. The South saw him as weak. The North saw him as a traitor. History mostly just forgets him. Still, Fillmore wasn't an idiot. He knew he was playing with matches in a powder keg. But like many leaders before cataclysmic change, he believed in process over passion, in bureaucracy over boldness. And that's how he got remembered. Not as a villain, but as a man who signed a compromise that failed to compromise. From failed peacemaking to accidental presidency, we now turn to Franklin Pierce, a man who never really wanted the job, but got it anyway. And in doing so, steered a nation closer to collapse. Franklin Pierce was a dark horse candidate who unexpectedly won the Democratic nomination. Franklin Pierce's rise to the presidency was as unexpected as it was unwanted, by everyone, including Pierce himself. He wasn't a front-runner, he wasn't even a runner. But in 1852, after the Democratic Party deadlocked over better-known candidates, they turned to a compromise no one had strong feelings about. A young, handsome, uncontroversial former senator from New Hampshire. Enter the dark horse, a political term Pierce helped redefine by simply existing. He looked the part, sure. clean-cut, eloquent, and war-tested from his brief and unremarkable stint in the Mexican-American War. But charisma isn't character. Pierce was, by many accounts, emotionally unstable, politically malleable, and deeply haunted by personal tragedies. Just before taking office, he and his wife witnessed the death of their only surviving child in a train accident. The boy was crushed before their eyes. Pierce took office cloaked in mourning, supported by a party in need of unity, and promptly did what he did best: try to please everyone. In doing so, he ended up pleasing no one. His administration pushed for the Kansas-Nebraska Act, essentially undoing the Missouri Compromise and reopening the brutal debate over slavery's expansion. The act sparked violence in Kansas and splintered the Democratic Party, all while Pierce looked on with paralyzed optimism. It's not that he was a villain. It's that he was overwhelmed, outmatched, and emotionally demolished before he ever began. His presidency became a study in how personal grief and public responsibility don't always coexist. And from one ghost in office to another, we now meet a president known more for inaction than action. James Buchanan, the man who watched the country slide into civil war and decided not to pick a side. Buckle up for passive disaster. James Buchanan was widely criticized for his handling of the growing secession crisis. If presidential power were measured in backbone, James Buchanan's legacy would be a chalk outline. As the 15th President of the United States, Buchanan had a front-row seat to the unraveling of the Union, and he mostly just watched. Not with malice, but with the glazed-over intensity of a man who desperately hoped the problem would solve itself if he just reread the Constitution enough times. When Southern states began openly talking about secession, Buchanan's response was a masterclass in rhetorical evasion. He insisted that while secession was illegal, the federal government had no constitutional authority to stop it, which, if you're following, means he declared the breakup of the country both wrong and untouchable. It was the political equivalent of watching your house burn down while debating insurance clauses. Buchanan wasn't a fool. He was a skilled diplomat and lifelong bureaucrat. But he was also a man so obsessed with legality and order that he froze in the face of crisis. His refusal to act decisively in 1860 and 1861 left Lincoln with a ticking time bomb upon entering office. 7 states had already seceded. Fort Sumter was next. Some historians argue Buchanan was merely adhering to constitutional limits. Others argue he was complicit by inaction. Either way, his presidency ended in a full-blown national fracture, and his name became synonymous with ineffectiveness at the worst possible moment. He left office as the Civil War loomed, his reputation in shreds, his nation in pieces, and he never seemed to fully understand why. Now, from passive paralysis to poetic paradox, we pivot to Abraham Lincoln, the rail splitter who wrestled, read, and reasoned his way through history's most combustible chapter. And yes, he kept important documents in his hat. Abraham Lincoln kept important papers and notes in his tall stovepipe hat. Abraham Lincoln didn't just wear that iconic stovepipe hat for fashion or height. He used it the way most people use the cloud, to store information. The man literally walked around with important papers tucked into the lining of his headgear. In a pre-digital, pre-briefcase presidency, Lincoln turned his hat into a portable filing cabinet. He kept speeches, notes, letters, political memos, anything he didn't want to lose. It's easy to picture. Honest Abe, 6'4" without the hat, towering even taller with it, nodding politely while presidential correspondence rustled above his scalp like secretive thoughts. This wasn't a gimmick. Lincoln's whole political life was built on improvisation, organization, and deep intellectual reflection. His memory was sharp, but his workload sharper. Between the war, emancipation, and trying to hold a violently fractured country together, he didn't have time for misplaced documents. So he stuck them where he could keep an eye on them, or at least ahead. The visual metaphor is almost too perfect. The weight of the Union, quite literally, on his head. A man carrying not just the burden of leadership, but also the paper trail of history. He wore the symbol of 19th century American gravity not just as ornament, but as storage. And somehow, in all of this, he never looked ridiculous. The hat was part of the man. Strange, tall, solemn, deliberate. Like a living monument, one that also happened to contain the Emancipation Proclamation in early draft form. Next, we travel from the stovepipe strategist to the impeached tailor. Andrew Johnson followed Lincoln and sewed his way into controversy, sometimes literally, sometimes constitutionally. Andrew Johnson was a tailor by trade and often made his own suits. Before Andrew Johnson became the most famous presidential impeachment story until the late 1990s, he was just a tailor from Tennessee with a chip on his shoulder and a needle in his hand. Born into poverty and orphaned early, Johnson never received formal schooling. But he did learn to stitch. And before he learned to sign laws, he learned to make jackets. That humble beginning remained oddly central to his self-image. Even after becoming president, Johnson would occasionally sit down with a needle and thread to mend or create his own clothes. In an era when politicians were expected to dress the part, suits pressed, collars stiff, Johnson refused to outsource dignity. He made it himself. It's an endearing image, if it weren't so overshadowed by everything else he did. Johnson became president after Lincoln's assassination, inheriting a broken country, a divided Congress, and a war-torn population desperate for direction. He responded by alienating almost everyone, pushing for rapid Southern reintegration with minimal consequences for former Confederates, and vetoing civil rights protections with the fervor of someone trying to win the worst timing award. Congress, not impressed by his homemade suits or tone-deaf vetoes, impeached him. He was acquitted by a single vote. He survived politically, but barely, and the needlepoint presidency ended with a frayed legacy. But that Taylor identity remained. He never shed it. He never wanted to. His story wasn't about transformation. It was about stubborn continuity. He brought the needle from Tennessee to D.C. and used it to sew himself into the fabric of post-war America, whether it fit or not. Now let's turn to another president with a gift for contradiction, Ulysses S. Grant. War hero, stoic leader, and apparently the kind of guy who could arrest himself on a casual day out. Let's break that down. Ulysses S. Grant was a prolific cigar smoker, which may have contributed to his later throat cancer. Ulysses S. Grant didn't just win the Civil War, he smoked his way through it. At one point, his cigar habit was so infamous it practically deserved its own battle ribbon. Grant was rarely seen without a cigar clenched between his teeth, puffing through strategy meetings, campaign trails, and post-battle celebrations like a man on a one-way path to bronchial chaos. It began as a modest habit, but the war made it a trademark. After a journalist casually mentioned Grant smoked cigars, grateful supporters began sending them by the crate. By mid-war, Grant was reportedly receiving over 10,000 cigars a year. Some people collect stamps. Grant collected potential tumors. He wasn't a showboater, just relentlessly habitual. The image of Grant hunched over battlefield maps, smoke coiling around his head, became a kind of visual shorthand for Union resolve. Quiet, gritty, unpretentious. The man didn't love cigars because it was fashionable. He loved them because they were his only indulgence. He barely drank after a period of struggle. He didn't preen. He led with a calm that unnerved his enemies and puzzled his friends. The cigars were his comfort, his shield, maybe even his companion in solitude. But habits leave marks. In his final years, long after the war and his scandal-riddled presidency, Grant developed throat cancer, most likely a direct consequence of his decades-long tobacco romance. He spent his last days racing against death to finish his memoirs, coughing blood into handkerchiefs while writing with the focus of a general plotting one last campaign. Those memoirs became both a literary triumph and financial salvation for his family. And the image of the dying Grant, writing through agony, silenced by the very smoke that once defined him, is almost too poetic to bear. Rutherford B Hayes had the first telephone in the White House with the number 1. Rutherford B Hayes wasn't exactly known for charisma. He wasn't known for bold speeches, sweeping reforms, or even particularly strong opinions. But he was the first president to bring the future into the White House by installing a telephone. And not just any phone. His number? 1. That's it. Just be 1. Because when you're the president in 1877, and there are fewer than a couple dozen phones in the entire country, you don't need area codes. You are area code. The phone itself was basically a glorified tin can with wires, installed by Alexander Graham Bell's own crew. It connected the White House to the Treasury Department down the street. Hayes reportedly found it more amusing than useful, considering the limited reach and the fact that almost no one else had one to call. Imagine inventing a social network and realizing your only friend is your accountant. Still, it was a symbolic moment. The executive mansion, still creaking with gas lamps and post-Civil War bureaucracy, had taken its first awkward step into modernity. Hayes, who didn't exactly come into office with fanfare, he lost the popular vote and was handed victory by a special commission, managed to stick his name in the tech history books without even trying, and he did it with a characteristic shrug. Hayes wasn't a visionary. He was a caretaker president, a transition figure. But by plugging a device into the wall that would eventually run the entire planet, he anchored the presidency to a fast-approaching future. James A. Garfield was shot by a disgruntled office seeker and died of complications from the wound. James A. Garfield didn't die because the bullet killed him. He died because 19th century medicine was a horror show disguised as science. In July of 1881, just 4 months into his presidency, Garfield was shot by Charles Guiteau, a deranged, self-proclaimed political savant who believed he deserved a government appointment and blamed the president for not handing him one. So he bought a gun, stalked Garfield to a D.C. train station, and shot him in the back. And yet, Garfield didn't die on the spot. The bullet lodged somewhere in his abdomen, and the real damage came not from the lead, but from what followed. Doctors poked, prodded, and fingered the wound with unwashed hands. They probed for the bullet repeatedly, ignoring burgeoning theories about antisepsis. Alexander Graham Bell even tried to use a makeshift metal detector to locate it, but the device was foiled by the metal bed springs no one thought to remove. Garfield lingered for 11 weeks. He wasted away under the care of the finest incompetents available. By the time he died in September, he had lost 80 pounds, endured constant infection, and essentially rotted from the inside while still conscious. His death turned him into a martyr, and his assassin into a symbol of the broken patronage system. It also paved the way for a man no one expected to rise. Chester A. Arthur, the fashionable party loyalist, suddenly handed the throne. And with him came velvet, elegance, and shockingly, reform. Chester A. Arthur was known for his extensive wardrobe and love of fashion. Before he was president, Chester A. Arthur was a sharp dresser. During his presidency, he became the sharp dresser. Known as Elegant Arthur, he reportedly owned over 80 pairs of pants and changed outfits several times a day. In a political landscape of bearded grumps and baggy frock coats, Arthur stood out like a diamond cufflink at a barn raising. He was the type of man who took tailoring seriously. He had his own valet. His mustache was always combed. His boots always polished. Visitors to the White House found a man more likely to debate silk versus wool than tariffs versus taxation. But beneath the wardrobe was a transformation no one saw coming. Arthur had been a classic political operator, deeply embedded in the corrupt patronage system that defined the Gilded Age. As vice president under Garfield, he was expected to be a do-nothing figurehead, a loyalist to the New York political machine that helped create him. Yet after Garfield's death and Arthur's ascension, something shifted. The man who'd benefited from cronyism became the unexpected champion of civil service reform. He signed the Pendleton Act, establishing merit-based government hiring and effectively dismantling the spoils system that had once sustained his career. It was like watching a mobster become a monk, only with better waistcoats. Arthur never ran for re-election, Perhaps he knew his moment was an accident. But in that moment, he evolved. The clothes stayed immaculate. But the man inside them, for once, wasn't just dressing the part. And now, from a bachelor with impeccable taste to a man who actually got married in the White House, Grover Cleveland, the only president to turn 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue into a wedding venue. Grover Cleveland was the only president to be married in the White House. Grover Cleveland didn't just get married during his presidency, he got married in the White House. In the Blue Room, under the chandelier, with reporters breathing down the door and America wondering if it was romantic or just weird. It was June 2nd, 1886. The bride was Frances Folsom, 21 years old. The groom, 49. Yes, you read that right. The age gap wasn't the strangest part. Frances had been the daughter of Cleveland's late law partner, and when her father died, Cleveland became her unofficial guardian. He watched her grow up, bought her books, sent her to college. And then he married her. America was stunned. The tabloids had a field day, but Cleveland, ever the unflappable bachelor-turned-bridegroom, didn't blink. He cut off the press and moved on. Frances became a sensation. The youngest first lady in history, stylish, charming, and impossibly poised, she turned the White House into something between a home and a magazine spread. Cleveland, for his part, doted on her, but remained the gruff, mustachioed curmudgeon he always was. Together, they made a strange but magnetic pair. Part power couple, part civic experiment in personal publicity. Cleveland's wedding wasn't just ceremonial, it was tactical. His administration was under pressure, and the romantic spectacle helped distract the public and reset the narrative. It also humanized a man known for vetoes and silence. For a moment, he wasn't just the president, he was a groom. Next, we step into another layer of legacy. Because the next president didn't just share Cleveland's office, he shared his DNA line. Benjamin Harrison, grandson of William Henry Harrison, brought electricity, whiskers, and awkward silence to the White House. And buttons. So many buttons. Benjamin Harrison was the grandson of President William Henry Harrison. Benjamin Harrison had big shoes to fill, assuming anyone remembered the man who wore them. His grandfather, William Henry Harrison, holds the dubious honor of the shortest presidency in U.S. history. 31 days and a fatal case of stubbornness in a rainstorm. Benjamin, on the other hand, got a full term, but spent much of it haunted by legacy rather than lifted by it. Being a presidential grandson is a strange fate. It's like inheriting a haunted house with one room. Everyone remembers how fast the last guy died, and no one remembers what he actually did. Benjamin was determined to build more than that. A Civil War general and meticulous lawyer, he ascended to the presidency with quiet intensity and the oratory skills of a man who never once doubted the Oxford comma. He was respectable, conservative, deeply religious, and unintentionally awkward. But he wasn't a clone of his grandfather. While William Henry rode the populist wave of log cabin campaigns, Benjamin ushered in a more corporate age. He supported high tariffs, a growing navy, and the first billion-dollar federal budget, an amount that horrified taxpayers and thrilled future defense contractors. And then there's electricity. Harrison was the first president to have electric lights installed in the White House, but he and his wife were so terrified of being electrocuted, they often refused to touch the switches. Sometimes they slept with the lights on. The future had arrived, and it made them nervous. Legacy-wise, Benjamin Harrison isn't famous, but he bridged two eras, the age of log cabins and the age of light bulbs. The last living Civil War general to sit in the Oval Office, a man caught between inheritance and innovation. Next comes a president who leaned into technology in a different way by stepping into film. William McKinley didn't just lead the country, he starred in its first presidential motion picture. William McKinley was the first president to be filmed while in office. Before YouTube, before C-SPAN, before TikTok filters turned candidates into floating heads with slogans, there was a grainy reel of William McKinley. The year was 1896. The cameras were giant, hissing metal monsters, and the idea of filming a president wasn't just novel, it was revolutionary. McKinley didn't seek the camera. The camera sought him. In an era when speeches were printed and photos posed, McKinley's moving image was a revelation. Audiences sat in silent theaters and watched a real, living president wave, smile, and breathe on screen. It was magic. It was eerie. It was the beginning of the presidency as performance art. And McKinley was the perfect figure for this transition. Calm, grandfatherly, and dignified to a fault. He didn't gesticulate wildly or deliver zingers. He stood still, nodded solemnly, and exuded a kind of sepia-toned statesmanship. His assassination in 1901 only magnified the footage's impact. Suddenly, his image wasn't just news, it was a relic. The irony, of course, is that McKinley's presidency was anything but slow. Underneath the calm demeanor, he oversaw the Spanish-American War, the annexation of territories, and the emergence of America as a bona fide imperial power. He expanded the U.S. footprint while looking like someone who might offer you tea in a parlor. His film appearance immortalized that contradiction. The soft-spoken expansionist, the gentleman imperialist, the first president you could watch on screen, and the first to prove how powerful stillness could be. And then came the bulldozer, Theodore Roosevelt, McKinley's vice president, his accidental successor, and the man who believed every moment in office should feel like a charge up San Juan Hill, preferably with a rifle in one hand and a moose in the other. Theodore Roosevelt was an avid big-game hunter and conservationist. Theodore Roosevelt hunted animals like his life depended on it, and then spent that life trying to save them. This wasn't hypocrisy. This was Rooseveltian logic. If you wanted to protect nature, you had to know how to kill it first. He once said, "The joy of living is his who has the heart to demand it." For Teddy, that meant camping, climbing, charging into war, and taking down large mammals with precision and pride. He killed lions in Africa, bears in the Rockies, and countless unnamed beasts across North America. Not out of malice, but out of ritual, out of a 19th century belief that domination was the gateway to respect. But here's the twist. Roosevelt didn't hunt because he hated nature. He hunted because he worshipped it. He founded the Boone and Crockett Club. He established 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, and over 150 national forests. He preserved 230 million acres of public land. He was both predator and protector. It sounds insane now. But Teddy Roosevelt was the kind of man who could deliver a 90-minute speech with a bullet in his chest. He didn't just do contradictions, he was contradiction. And that made him the perfect avatar for America at the dawn of the 20th century. Bold, dangerous, self-righteous, and occasionally wise. He saw nature as something to be preserved, not tamed, except when it annoyed him. Then it was rifle time. From hunting grounds to oyster plates, we pivot to a president who preferred indulgence over expedition. William Howard Taft is next, and his appetite wasn't just legendary, it was practically structural. William Howard Taft's favorite food was said to be oysters. William Howard Taft didn't just enjoy oysters. He consumed them by the dozen with the devotion of a gourmand who never met a mollusk he didn't like. Oysters, those slick, salty little delicacies, weren't just a culinary preference. They were a dietary lifestyle. And for the man who remains the heaviest president in U.S. history, weighing in at over 300 pounds, that says a lot. Taft's appetite was legendary, but his oyster enthusiasm sits atop the food chain. He could, and reportedly did, eat dozens in a single sitting. Raw, baked, stewed, it didn't matter. If they could be pried open and slurped, they were fair game. In a political age when dinner parties were PR events and White House menus were statements of taste, Taft made it clear that decadence was very much on the table. The irony, of course, is that Taft never wanted to be president. He wanted to be a Supreme Court justice. The whole Oval Office detour was orchestrated by his wife and his friend Teddy Roosevelt, who believed Taft would carry on the progressive torch. Instead, Taft proved more conservative than expected, and Roosevelt came back to run against him. The result? A brutal election, a split Republican Party, and the election of Woodrow Wilson. Still, Taft managed to do something few others ever could. After his presidency, he finally got the job he really wanted, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the only man in American history to head both branches. And he did it with a stomach full of oysters and a reputation both mocked and misunderstood. Next up, the man who beat him, Woodrow Wilson. A professor with a pen, a law degree, and a moral mission, he brought academia into warfare. Let's crack that paradox open. Woodrow Wilson had a law degree and taught at Princeton University. Woodrow Wilson was a president with a syllabus. He came to politics not through battlefield heroics or business acumen, but through books, lectures, and long-winded footnotes. A former professor, university president, and political theorist, Wilson was the closest thing the Oval Office has had to a tenured scholar-in-chief. He was also a man who could weaponize intellect as effectively as any general could wield artillery. He earned a law degree, but hated practicing law. Too messy, too slow, too dependent on charm. Academia suited him better, especially Princeton, where he became president and spent his days writing, speaking, and reforming the curriculum with the kind of zeal normally reserved for crusaders and cult leaders. When he finally turned to politics, Wilson brought with him a deep belief in idealism and a dangerously high opinion of his own moral clarity. He didn't just want to govern. He wanted to reshape the soul of the nation. His presidency ushered in the Federal Reserve, antitrust laws, income tax reform, and, oh yes, World War I. Wilson saw the war as an opportunity to reorder the world. His 14-point speech reads like a civics textbook written in heaven. Democracy, diplomacy, self-determination. Noble stuff, until the actual peace talks, where he stubbornly alienated allies and enemies alike. His obsession with the League of Nations became his undoing, as the U.S. Senate rejected it, and Wilson suffered a debilitating stroke trying to push it through. By the end, his presidency resembled a Shakespearean tragedy. The scholar who tried to save the world ended up a broken man, hidden from view. His wife Edith quietly running the country behind the curtain. Now, from lofty ideals to canine cabinets, we slide into the presidency of Warren G. Harding, a man whose dog had more political instincts than most of his advisors. Meet Laddie Boy. Warren G. Harding had a pet dog, an Airedale Terrier named Laddie Boy, who had his own cabinet seat. Warren G. Harding may not be remembered for economic genius or geopolitical brilliance, but he knew a thing or two about optics. Enter Laddie Boy, the Airedale Terrier, who became more famous than half of Harding's cabinet, and may well have been smarter too. Laddie Boy wasn't just a pet. He was a presidential co-star. Newspapers covered his daily routine. Children sent him fan letters. He had a sculpted portrait in the White House, and yes, he had his own chair at cabinet meetings. The symbolism was half satire, half showbiz. While Harding's human advisors were busy embroiling themselves in scandals like Teapot Dome, Laddie Boy sat there, ears perked, offering the only incorruptible presence in the room. Harding knew what he was doing. He used Laddie Boy as a soft-focused distraction from the growing chaos of his administration. Where Harding fumbled policy and ducked responsibility, Laddie Boy fetched sticks and warmed hearts. He was the first White House dog to be treated like a celebrity, paving the way for the likes of Beau Obama and Major Biden. And honestly, it worked. Americans loved the dog. He humanized Harding, even as the president's cronies looted federal departments like kids in a candy store. Laddie Boy became a kind of mascot for a presidency adrift. One bright, barking spot in an otherwise hazy swamp of incompetence. So next time you see a dog in a political ad, thank Laddie Boy. He was the original spin doctor with a tail. Now let's ride that absurdity into the Coolidge years, where electric horses were the new normal and silence was a strategy. Yes, the next president liked to gallop nowhere, Indoors, repeatedly. Calvin Coolidge often startled White House staff by appearing suddenly after silent naps. Calvin Coolidge didn't walk. He materialized. One moment you were dusting a banister, the next, the president was standing behind you, silent as a ghost in brogues. This wasn't a theatrical trick. It was just Coolidge being Coolidge. Understated, unsettling, and absurdly quiet. So quiet, in fact, that he developed a knack for startling his own staff simply by waking up and walking into the room. Coolidge's naps were legendary. He reportedly slept up to 11 hours a day and indulged in lengthy afternoon slumbers. But it wasn't just the quantity of rest. It was the eerie stealth with which he resumed consciousness. He'd nap behind a door, under a desk, anywhere the light was soft and the government sufficiently unchaotic. Then, without warning, he'd reappear. No fanfare, no cough, no footsteps. Just a silent president making aides drop papers in mild terror. This ghostliness dovetailed with his political style. Silent Cal wasn't just a nickname, it was an ethos. He believed in saying little, doing less, and letting the country manage itself. And in a decade fueled by roaring change, jazz-age excess, and bootlegged optimism, Coolidge's stillness felt either like timeless wisdom or profound disengagement. He wasn't a bombastic leader. He didn't pretend to be. He vetoed recklessly, delegated freely, and kept government small. Not because it was a trendy ideology, but because he genuinely believed people should be left alone. It worked. Until it didn't. The crash came after him, but the mood of detachment bore his signature. And behind all of it, a man so quiet he could vanish mid-nap and reappear mid-thought, like a political poltergeist. From spectral silence, we move to orphaned resilience. Herbert Hoover didn't nap his way into history. He mined, starved, and calculated his way there. Let's drill into that. Herbert Hoover was known for his passion for fishing, especially fly fishing. Herbert Hoover may have been known as the man who presided over the Great Depression's dark descent. But when he wasn't drowning in economic catastrophe, he preferred literal water. Rivers, lakes, mountain streams, anywhere a man could cast a line and forget that Wall Street existed. His preferred method? Fly fishing. Precision, solitude, and strategy. Everything politics was not. Hoover saw fishing not just as recreation, but as philosophical necessity. It was, in his words, a way to avoid talking too much, a way to exist outside of Washington's noise and numbers. And for a man who once engineered food relief for millions in post-World War I Europe, the appeal of silence and simplicity was understandable. Fly fishing didn't involve parliaments or press conferences. It involved water, line, and focus. Bliss. Even while in office, Hoover found ways to sneak out for fishing trips. His retreat in Virginia, Rapidan Camp, was built in part to facilitate these excursions. There, he played the role of rustic recluse, escaping the mounting political chaos for the soothing trickle of streams and the meditative flick of a cast. But no amount of trout could shield him from the economic tsunami of 1929. When the stock market collapsed, Hoover's engineering instincts failed him. The man who'd fed war-torn Europe couldn't calm a panicked America. He hesitated, he equivocated, and he paid the price. His name became a punchline. Hoovervilles, Hoover blankets, mockeries of a legacy he couldn't control. And yet, in the wild, with a rod in hand, Hoover was something else. Peaceful, methodical, almost joyful. A man casting for order in a world spinning out. Now we pivot from rods to paws. The next president had a German shepherd named Major, not just a pet, but an Alsatian diplomat with a bark that echoed through the White House halls. Franklin D. Roosevelt had a pet dog named Major, who was an Alsatian, German shepherd. Before FDR became synonymous with fireside chats, wartime resolve, and a third term that broke all the rules, he was just another man who loved his dog. And not just any dog, Major, an Alsatian with the posture of a soldier and the temperament of a watchdog who'd seen things. Major wasn't the most famous of FDR's dogs. That would be Fala, the beloved Scottish terrier, with press coverage most congressmen would kill for. But before Fala, there was Major. Tall, imposing, fiercely loyal, and just a little too intense for Washington society. Major's tenure at the White House wasn't smooth. He had a habit of nipping at visitors, once reportedly going after the British Prime Minister's trousers. Not exactly diplomatic behavior, but somehow fitting for a dog owned by a president facing the Great Depression and later World War II. Where FDR's public image was calm and reassuring, Major embodied the underlying tension, a creature always on alert, always ready to bite. Eventually, Major was retired from public duty, shuffled off to the Roosevelt estate, where he could roam free without tearing into dignitaries, but his presence left a mark. He was FDR's canine alter ego, loyal, combative, sharp-toothed, and in an administration built on balancing charm with command, Major was the growl beneath the smile. FDR would go on to define modern presidency, radio, charisma, unprecedented terms, but he never stopped surrounding himself with animals that reflected the contradictions of his era. Gentle public image, ruthless internal calculation, smiles in front, fangs just behind. Next, we meet a man who didn't growl, he snapped. Harry S. Truman, poker-faced and poker-fisted, is about to step into the spotlight. Get ready for bluntness with a side of bourbon. Harry S. Truman had famously short temper. Harry S. Truman didn't just speak plainly, he detonated. His temper was a trademark, a hand grenade lobbed across political niceties with alarming frequency. In a town of polished veneers and passive-aggressive maneuvering, Truman was a human thunderclap in horn-rimmed glasses. He didn't suffer fools, or critics, or anyone who questioned his family. When a music reviewer panned his daughter Margaret's piano recital, Truman wrote a letter so volcanic in tone it practically smoked. "I have never met you," it read, "but if I do, you'll need a new nose." That wasn't a threat. That was presidential punctuation. And he didn't just reserve his ire for cultural snobs. He blew up at reporters, political enemies, sometimes even his own allies. During a visit to Congress, a senator commented that the president looked worried. Truman, without missing a beat, said, "I'm not worried, I'm mad." That was his default setting, rage wrapped in discipline, fueled by bourbon and stubbornness. Yet beneath the temper was a surprisingly principled core. Truman didn't explode out of vanity. He exploded out of conviction. He made unpopular decisions with a jaw set like concrete, dropping atomic bombs, integrating the military, firing General MacArthur. He didn't flinch. He fumed, and then he moved on. The country didn't always love him for it, but Truman didn't run on charm. He ran on resolve. His anger wasn't performative, it was policy. He showed the world that fury, when grounded in principle, could sometimes steer a nation straighter than charm ever could. And speaking of unexpected softness, next we turn to a man who led invasions, built highways, and warned against the military-industrial complex, and then sat down with a brush and canvas. Dwight D. Eisenhower, amateur painter. Let's paint that picture. Dwight D. Eisenhower was a talented amateur painter. Dwight D. Eisenhower is best remembered for orchestrating D-Day, commanding Allied forces, and guiding America through the white-hot tensions of the Cold War. But behind the medals and military strategy maps was something far more delicate. A paintbrush. Eisenhower took up painting late in life, and not as a public gimmick. It wasn't for show. It was therapy. It was meditation. It was, in his own words, to relieve the tensions of public life. While other world leaders puffed cigars or plotted geopolitical chess moves, Ike quietly worked on landscapes, portraits, and still lifes. His technique wasn't revolutionary, but it was deeply personal. He painted portraits of his wife Mamie, scenic countrysides, and even attempted a few self-portraits. Some were surprisingly good. Others were charmingly amateurish. All of them reflected a mind trying to find stillness amid the chaos of global power. He wasn't shy about his hobby either. He once gifted a painting to Winston Churchill, another political titan who dabbled in oils. The two old warriors, men who had literally fought Hitler, now traded brushes and critiques like retired art students. It was absurd. It was wholesome. It was the kind of contradiction that made Eisenhower deeply human. And it mattered. Because Eisenhower's presidency was often criticized as too passive, too disengaged. But in truth, he led like a general, with restraint, strategy, and a long view. He knew that behind every war was a cost, behind every policy, a human face. His paintings weren't political. They were reminders that even the most hardened commanders need softness to survive. And speaking of young and charismatic, a stark contrast comes next. The youngest man ever elected president. John F. Kennedy wasn't just youth in a suit. He was charm weaponized. Let's step into the era of Camelot. John F. Kennedy was the youngest person elected president. John F. Kennedy didn't just bring youth to the White House. He brought myth. At 43, JFK was the youngest elected president in American history and the first born in the 20th century. The air crackled differently when he spoke. The lighting shifted. The background music practically wrote itself. He was Catholic in a Protestant stronghold. He was Ivy League in a working-class era. He was vibrant, tanned, poised, and as frail as the Constitution he vowed to uphold. Behind the vigor and ocean blue eyes was a body riddled with pain. Addison's disease, a bad back, and a cocktail of medications that could tranquilize a horse. But no one saw that. They saw the projection, the youth, the modernity. His campaign against Richard Nixon was the first true media war. On television, Kennedy looked like the future, composed, clear-eyed, sculpted by optimism. Nixon, by comparison, looked like he'd crawled out of a policy memo with a 5 o'clock shadow. It wasn't just politics, it was image alchemy. Kennedy won with 49.7% of the vote. Barely. But the margin didn't matter, the moment did. In office, JFK radiated a sense of mission. Civil rights, space exploration, Cold War containment. His speeches soared even when policy stumbled. Ask not what your country can do for you became both an anthem and a challenge. He inspired hope and harbored secrets, because behind Camelot's golden glow was darkness, affairs, conspiracies, failures in Cuba, secrets that would leak for decades. And then, in Dallas, it ended. The youngest elected president died the most cinematic of deaths. Live, on film, in a convertible. America wept, and never quite trusted the story again. Now, from myth to malfunction, we pivot to another young president. This one Southern, shrewd, and fond of conducting meetings while multitasking. In the bathroom. Get ready. Lyndon B. Johnson is up next. Lyndon B. Johnson sometimes conducted meetings from his bathroom. There are power moves, and then there's Lyndon B. Johnson holding court on the toilet. Not figuratively, literally. As in cabinet meetings, briefings, and policy discussions delivered through the sound of flushing water and echoed tile. To LBJ, the bathroom wasn't private. It was just another wing of the West Wing. He believed in the full court press of presence. If you were in his orbit, you were in all of it. Johnson's aides learned early that proximity mattered more than decorum. If he was mid-conversation and nature called, the conversation continued. Door open, pants down, ideas flowing. Visitors who recoiled were seen as weak. Those who stayed got promoted. It was crude. It was aggressive. It was vintage LBJ. He was obsessed with control, dominance, and theatrics. Johnson measured his worth in inches of legislation passed and feet of personal space violated. He'd loom over aides, talk inches from their faces, and drag senators into tiny elevators for one-on-one arm twisting. The bathroom was just one more stage in the political theater of intimidation. But the oddity worked. He got results. Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, Medicare, Medicaid, the Great Society. His domestic accomplishments were seismic and often pushed through with tactics that left everyone breathless and a little traumatized. His obsession with power extended to the smallest things. He once ordered custom pants with extra room for the nuts, as he explained in a now infamous taped phone call. It's juvenile. It's hilarious. It's disturbingly real. Yet for all his bluster, Johnson left the presidency shattered by Vietnam, mistrusted and angry. His raw political genius couldn't hide the bloodshed. The bathroom diplomacy couldn't clean it. And now, from the profane to the paranoid, we descend into the basement of American political psychology. Richard Nixon, master manipulator, insecure genius, and an absolutely lethal force at the bowling alley. Richard Nixon was an excellent bowler. Richard Nixon didn't just bowl, he escaped through it. Downstairs in the White House, below the Oval Office, and beneath the roiling storm of Watergate, Cold War anxiety and a press corps baying for blood, Nixon had his sanctuary, a single-lane bowling alley. It was narrow, windowless, a place where pins fell without protest. He bowled with intensity, the way other men pray. Long after aides went home, Nixon would descend alone, rolling strike after strike in eerie silence. He was reportedly very good, consistent, focused, obsessively precise. Everything he wanted his presidency to be. The image is bizarre. The most paranoid president in U.S. history, who recorded his own downfall and saw betrayal in every corner, silently knocking down pins in the belly of the White House. But it fits. Bowling is solitary. It's repetitive. It's a controlled environment. You aim, you act, and something falls. Unlike the chaos of foreign policy or domestic protest, pins don't talk back. Nixon's love for bowling was so real, he even had special shoes and a custom ball. The Secret Service sometimes joined, but mostly it was just him, alone with his thoughts and his demons, playing a game that didn't leak to the press. It's easy to laugh at, until you realize the metaphor. Nixon built his presidency like a bowling frame. All set up, explosive release, and then watching the results from a fixed point, powerless to change their course. He bowled through crises the way some men smoke, or pace, or pray. But pins always reset. The nation didn't. And on that note, we rise from the bowling cellar to something more exalted. Our next fact takes us back to the first, the general turned president, the man who walked away from a monarchy and into myth. George Washington is back in frame. And his teeth? They're not what you think.